Hey everyone! Welcome back to The Potter Show. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Harry stood up at the welcoming feast and asked Dumbledore, "Why did you place 39 loyalty potions in my food?" Smash that like button and subscribe for more! Here we go. Chapter 1. The question nobody asked. The candles were floating. Harry noticed them first, not the enchanted ceiling churning with bruised purple clouds, not the 4 long tables crammed with students in brand new robes, not the ghosts drifting through walls like they had somewhere better to be. The candles. Hundreds of them, hanging in the air with no visible means of support, flames perfectly still despite the drafts that kept tugging at the back of Harry's neck. He filed that away. Things that looked impossible usually had an explanation. You just had to be patient enough to find it. He'd been patient his whole life. The sorting had gone the way most things went when Harry was involved, strangely, and with an audience. The sorting hat had dropped onto his head and gone quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that made the watching students shift in their seats. Harry had felt something brush against his thoughts, not painfully, just firmly, like someone pressing a hand flat against a closed door, and he pressed back. The hat had made a sound that might have been surprise, and then it had said, into the private space between his ears, "You're going to be trouble, aren't you?" Harry had thought, probably. The hat had laughed. Then it had shouted, "Gryffindor!" to the hall, and Harry had handed it back to Professor McGonagall with a polite nod and walked to the red and gold table like he hadn't just held a mental shoving match with a 1,000-year-old piece of clothing. That had been 20 minutes ago. Now he was sitting between a round-faced boy named Neville who kept looking at his empty plate like it might bite him, and a girl named Hermione who had already identified every dish on the table by name and cross-referenced them with Hogwarts, a history. The food had appeared the moment the headmaster, tall, bearded, half-moon glasses perched on an enormous nose, had finished his opening remarks and spread his arms wide. Harry had not eaten. He was looking at his plate. He'd been looking at it for 4 minutes. "You're not eating," Hermione said, in the tone of someone reporting a factual irregularity. "I notice," Harry said. "The roast potatoes are excellent," she added, apparently deciding encouragement was the next logical step. "I've had them. They're fine." "I'm sure they are." Neville was eating cautiously, a boy who had clearly learned to enjoy meals while he could, which told Harry something about Neville's home life. The rest of the table was a controlled riot of noise and reaching arms and someone further down shouting about a Quidditch team. 2 red-haired twins were attempting to launch peas at a portrait using spoons as catapults. The portrait kept moving out of the way and looking offended. Harry watched all of it, and kept his eyes moving and did not touch the food. The thing was, he'd grown up in the Dursleys' house. That meant 10 years of learning how people moved when they thought no one was watching, what adults sounded like when they were lying versus when they were simply wrong, and what it felt like when a situation had been arranged. Petunia Dursley arranged things constantly. The placement of family photos where the Potters were absent, the careful phrasing that kept neighbors from asking too many questions, the specific angle of every kindness she showed Dudley, which was always framed so Harry could see exactly what he wasn't getting. Harry knew arranged situations the way other kids knew their multiplication tables. This situation felt arranged. He'd been feeling it since Diagon Alley, the way Hagrid had steered him, gently but insistently, toward specific shops. The way people on the street had stared at his scar and said him in that reverent whisper, as though he were something precious and fragile. The way his Hogwarts letter had arrived with a precision that suggested someone had been watching his address for a very long time. Every piece of the last month had felt like walking down a corridor where all the doors except one were locked. He reached into his robe pocket and pulled out the small glass vial he'd prepared in his dormitory before the feast. Hermione, because she was Hermione, noticed immediately. "What's that?" "A testing vial," Harry said. "You can make them with standard potions ingredients. The instructions were in Basic Potions Compendium, Chapter 3. He uncorked it carefully. "I made 2 this afternoon when the rest of you were looking at the common room." Hermione's eyes went to the vial, then to his plate, then back to the vial. The sequence of logical conclusions crossed her face like weather. You're going to test the food. I'm going to test the food. That's. She stopped. Restarted. That's actually quite sensible. Neville had stopped eating. He was watching Harry with wide eyes, a fork still raised halfway to his mouth. Harry dipped the vial's opening into his pumpkin juice, let it fill halfway, then ran a single drop along the inside of his arm just above the wrist, the testing area specified in the compendium. He watched the color. It went green. Then it went darker green. Then it went through 4 more shades of green that the vial's included color chart didn't even cover, which was interesting because the chart went up to 12 and Harry had to count carefully to make sure he wasn't miscounting. He counted 3 times. 39. He sat with that number for a moment. The noise of the great hall moved around him like water around a stone, all that cheerful chaos, all those floating candles, all that carefully orchestrated welcome. He thought about the man at the high table with the half-moon glasses and the long silver beard, who had stood up and spread his arms and said "Welcome home" in a voice that somehow reached every corner of the room at once. Harry thought about the word home and what Dumbledore probably meant by it, and what Harry had actually experienced in the specific home he'd been placed in, and whether those two things overlapping was an accident. He stood up. The immediate vicinity went quiet first. Hermione, Neville, the cluster of first-years within earshot who'd been watching the vial test with growing curiosity. Then the quiet spread outward the way quiet always does in a large room when someone does something that doesn't fit, rippling table by table until the twin with the pea catapult lowered his spoon and the portrait stopped looking offended and the ghosts drifted a few inches closer. Harry looked up at the head table. Dumbledore was watching him with an expression of polite curiosity, the kind that had been assembled carefully, like furniture. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said. His voice carried. He hadn't shouted, hadn't needed to. 11 years in the Dursley house had taught him that calm voices in silent rooms were far more dangerous than loud ones. "Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said warmly. "Is everything all right?" "I have a question," Harry said. "By all means." Harry held up the vial. The contents had settled into a color that wasn't quite green and wasn't quite black and didn't exist on the standard chart. "Why did you place 39 loyalty potions in my food?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence to the one before. Before, it had been the silence of curiosity. What's that first year doing? The silence after was the silence of a room full of people trying to work out if they'd heard correctly, running the sentence back, deciding they had, and then not knowing what to do with that decision. Professor McGonagall had gone very still in the way that tall people go still when they are trying not to move their face. Professor Quirrell made a sound that might have been a word, abandoned it, and raised his water goblet to his lips as though that had been his intention all along. Snape did nothing. He was already watching Harry with the flat, evaluative attention of someone who has been waiting for a particular shoe to drop, and the shoe had just dropped, and he was looking at it. Dumbledore smiled. It was a good smile. Harry had to give him that. Warm, a little confused, perfectly calibrated. "My dear boy, that is quite the vial is a claret standard compound testing solution," Harry said, cutting through the warmth before it could establish itself. "It registers loyalty potions specifically on the green spectrum. The chart goes to 12. My reading was 39. He set the vial on the table. "I'd appreciate a direct answer." A boy further down the Slytherin table, pale, blond, with the kind of posture that came from being told since birth that posture mattered, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Draco Malfoy. Harry had seen him on the train, had clocked the casual cruelty wrapped in casual confidence, had noted the way he looked at Harry's scar like it was something he was owed a piece of. He was looking at Harry differently now. Dumbledore's smile had not moved. That was actually impressive. Most people, when caught off guard, showed it in the corners of their mouths. Dumbledore's smile stayed perfectly in place, like a painting. "Testing solutions of that complexity are fourth-year material at the earliest," Dumbledore said. His voice was still warm, still carrying, but it had a different texture now, the texture of a man choosing his words the way a chess player chooses pieces. I'm curious where a first-year student came across one. Chapter 3. Harry said. Standard ingredients. I made 2, actually, in case the first one was contaminated. They agreed. He paused. You didn't answer my question. Harry. McGonagall's voice came out sharper than she seemed to intend. She had turned slightly in her chair, not quite standing, not quite sitting, caught in the between space. Perhaps this is a conversation better suited to, the Great Hall is fine, Harry said pleasantly. I asked in the Great Hall because I thought it was better to ask in front of everyone than to be walked to a private office where the conversation could be managed. He looked at Dumbledore. I've noticed that a lot of conversations get managed. Somewhere behind him, he heard Hermione breathe in very sharply. A sixth-year Ravenclaw girl 2 tables over whispered something to her friend. The friend's mouth opened. Dumbledore unfolded from his chair. He was taller standing than he seemed sitting. Harry had not quite accounted for how tall, and the movement was slow, deliberate, the movement of a man who understood that physical presence was itself a kind of argument. He looked at Harry over the half-moon glasses, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a moment, something passed through his eyes that was neither warm nor confused. Harry recognized it. It was the look Petunia got when he'd done something she hadn't predicted. Mr. Potter, Dumbledore said, and now the warmth in his voice had been refined into something more precise, more direct, a beam rather than a flood. You are 11 years old, it is your first evening at Hogwarts, and you have had what I'm sure has been a tremendously overwhelming day. The testing solution you describe is, I assure you, not infallible at first-year application. I'd be happy to test anyone else's plate, Harry said. I brought enough solution. Or the school nurse could do it with the standard diagnostic kit. I imagine Madame Pomfrey has one. He turned and found the Hufflepuff table, where a stocky girl with braids was watching him with her mouth open. Or I could ask if anyone in this room has a potions background who'd like to verify. That's enough. The voice came from Snape. Not loud, not theatrical, just flat, and precise, and absolute enough to cut through the room's growing noise. Everyone looked at him. Snape was still seated, dark eyes moving between Harry and Dumbledore with the attention of a man reading 2 texts simultaneously. The boy asked a question, Snape said. The question was specific. If the headmaster has an answer, the appropriate response is the answer. The Great Hall collectively held its breath. McGonagall was looking at Snape like he'd just done something she couldn't classify. Dumbledore looked at Snape for a long moment, the beam of his attention shifting slowly, and Snape returned the look without blinking, without moving, without any of the careful performance of deference that Harry had noticed most staff directed at the headmaster automatically. It was a conversation without words, and it lasted exactly as long as Dumbledore allowed it to before he turned back to Harry. Perhaps, Dumbledore said, and his voice was quieter now, more personal, aimed at Harry in a way that acknowledged, finally, that the room was watching. We might continue this conversation in my office. I will explain everything, you'll explain it here, Harry said. Or I'll walk to the Oli tonight and send a letter to the ministry. I know the address. And I've already written the letter. It just needs posting. He reached into his robe pocket and produced a folded envelope. He set it on the table next to the vial. I wrote it this afternoon in case. I write things in advance when I think I might need them. He had not written a letter. The envelope contained a folded piece of blank parchment. But Dumbledore didn't know that, and more importantly, the rest of the room didn't know that, and a threat that's believed is functionally identical to a threat that's real. Petunia Disley had taught him that too, though she hadn't meant to. Dumbledore's eyes moved to the envelope. They stayed there for 2 full seconds. Then, for the first time all evening, the smile moved. Not gone, changed. Recalibrated. The warmth had been replaced with something that was, Harry thought, closer to the truth of the man's face. The food at Hogwarts, Dumbledore said slowly, is prepared with a number of protective measures that are standard for. 39 loyalty potions aren't protective measures. Harry said. Loyalty potions are specifically designed to generate emotional attachment to a designated target or institution. They don't protect against poisoning, they don't guard against allergens, they don't do anything that a standard school food preparation protocol would require. He looked at the headmaster steadily. I read the potions index on the train. I had time. Someone at the Ravenclaw table started clapping, then stopped immediately when they realized no one else had joined in. Draco Malfoy had stopped leaning forward. He was sitting back now, and his expression had moved through surprise, through calculation, and arrived somewhere that Harry couldn't quite read, which was unusual enough to note. The train journey is 4 hours, said a lanky red-haired boy near the middle of the Gryffindor table, apparently unable to stop himself. His twin made a frantic gesture. What? He read the whole potions index in 4 hours. I read fast, Harry said, without looking away from Dumbledore. Dumbledore sat back down. It was a strategic retreat, and everyone in the room who was paying attention understood it as one, which meant everyone in the room was paying attention. He lowered himself into his chair with the same deliberate slowness he'd risen with, settled his robes, and folded his hands on the table. The half-moon glasses caught the candlelight and threw small golden shapes across the white tablecloth. Mr. Potter, he said, I think you will find, as you grow and learn, that the world is far more complex than it appears to an 11-year-old boy. There are matters of safety, of preparation, of ensuring that, Professor, Harry said, and this time there was something different in his voice, not louder, not sharper, just heavier, the weight of someone who is choosing their next move very carefully and wants it known that they are choosing. I have lived in a cupboard under the stairs for 10 years. I have been told that my parents died in a car crash that my father caused while drunk, even though my father apparently didn't drive and wasn't given to drinking. I have been given broken toys and Dudley's leftover clothes and the specific, careful silence of a household that needed me to not ask questions. He looked at Dumbledore without any performance in it, without anger or trembling or any of the things people expected from children in this kind of moment. I am very good at noticing when people need me to not ask questions. I'm asking anyway. The great hall was absolutely silent. McGonagall had looked away from the table. Her jaw was tight in a way that suggested she was doing something difficult with it. Quirrell's water goblet was still at his lips. It had been there for some time. He grew up in a cupboard? Someone whispered from the Hufflepuff table. A cupboard under the stairs, someone else confirmed. Dumbledore's expression had not broken. It had compressed, drawn inward, like something pulling against a spring. When he spoke, his voice had shed the last of its performance, and become something much more direct, which Harry noted was what happened when people ran out of available moves. There are things, Dumbledore said carefully, that were done for your protection. For the protection of the wider wizarding world. Things that required certain preparations. Certain measures to ensure that when the time came. The time for what? Harry asked. Silence. The time, Harry said. For what? What was I being prepared for? What did 39 loyalty potions in my food need me to feel loyal to, exactly? Hogwarts in general? Or a specific person at Hogwarts? He let that sit for a moment, then said quieter, I think we both know which one it was. Potter. Snape's voice again, unexpected, but this time it wasn't cutting him off. It was something else. A kind of warning that was pointed in the wrong direction, aimed not at Harry but somewhere adjacent to him, like a man clearing the path rather than blocking it. Perhaps, Snape said, the headmaster might provide the answer without the atmosphere. Dumbledore looked at Snape again. A longer look this time. Whatever that look contained, it made McGonagall set down her goblet. The boy deserves a straight answer, Albus, she said quietly. The use of the first name landed differently than anything else in the last 10 minutes. Not because it was informal. Harry understood they were colleagues of long standing, but because of what it meant when someone drops the title in a public space. It meant she had decided, for this specific moment, to stop being careful. Dumbledore looked at her. He looked at Harry. He looked at the envelope on the table, which Harry watched carefully to make sure his expression stayed entirely neutral, which it did. "There are measures," Dumbledore said at last, "taken during food preparation in highly sensitive circumstances, whereas students' integration into the magical community must be managed carefully, to ensure the smoothest possible what?" Harry asked. "Transition," Dumbledore said. "A transition into feeling loyal to you," Harry said. "Not an accusation. A statement." He said it the way you'd state that the sky was presently a particular color. 39 loyalty potions compounding toward a single designated target. Which was you? He paused. How long were they meant to last? Dumbledore said nothing. The potions index said loyalty compounds with repeat dosing, Harry said. Each dose extends and deepens the previous one. 39 doses, taken together, would create a baseline loyalty response that's functionally indistinguishable from genuine feeling. He tilted his head. Was this going to be every feast? Every meal? Or just the first one, because the first impression is the deepest? Harry, was it Voldemort? Harry said. Is that why? Some plan where I'm supposed to trust you absolutely, and you need that trust to be structural rather than earned, because a plan that requires me to trust you completely can't afford to wait and see whether I'd actually trust you on my own? Dumbledore flinched. It was small. It was controlled. It happened anyway. The Great Hall had become the quietest it had been since Harry sat down, and the quietest it would likely be for a very long time. Harry looked at the untouched food on his plate. The roast potatoes Hermione had recommended. The pumpkin juice in his goblet, still shifting with that dark green color that wasn't on the chart. He looked at Dumbledore. I'm not going to eat it, Harry said. And I'd like to know, respectfully and directly, whether the answer you've been building up to is going to be honest, because I think a lot of people in this room are currently deciding something about who you are, and your next sentence is going to be part of that decision. He sat down. Not because he was finished, because he had said the thing that needed saying, and anything added after that would just be noise, and Harry had never liked noise. The feast continued, eventually. Dumbledore did not give a direct answer that night. He said something measured and carefully phrased about complex protective protocols and the unique challenges of Mr. Potter's situation, which was not an answer but was also not a denial, and which the older students immediately understood as its own kind of confession. He concluded with a request for Harry to come to his office after the meal, which Harry heard, acknowledged with a polite nod, and had no intention of honoring without witnesses. The conversation at the Gryffindor table had fractured into two separate currents. The one nearest Harry was very quiet, populated by first-years who were sitting with their food and processing. The one further down was considerably louder, populated by older students who had immediately begun speculating with the energy of people who have just been given an enormous amount of material to work with. A cupboard, she said, 39, that's not just protective, that's... Snape told Dumbledore to answer straight. Did anyone else notice that? Hermione had not touched her own food since the test. She was sitting with her arms folded on the table, looking at the middle distance with the specific focused expression of someone categorizing information at high speed. The testing solution, she said at last, to the table between them rather than directly at Harry. Chapter 3 of the Compendium. I read that this morning. I know, Harry said. I didn't think to test anything with it. You weren't raised to think things might be wrong by default, Harry said. Not unkindly. I was. He picked up a bread roll, examined it, set it back down. The roll is probably fine. The potions were in the juice and the main dishes. The compound would break down in bread. He paused. Probably. Neville was looking at the remains of his own plate with a pale, slightly green expression. I already ate. The potions were targeted, Harry said. They were in the dishes nearest my seat. Whoever prepared them knew where I'd be sitting. He glanced at Neville. You'll be fine. How do you know they were targeted? Because if they'd been in all the food, half the school would be walking around irrationally devoted to Dumbledore on varying loyalty baselines, and that would create observable behavioral discrepancies within the first week of term that any competent staff member would notice. Harry thought about it. Although, maybe they've been doing this for years with the prefects. That would explain. He stopped. I'll look into that later. Hermione's head turned sharply. You think he might have been doing this to other students? I think it's a question worth asking, Harry said carefully. I don't have evidence yet. I try not to reach conclusions before the evidence. He met her eyes. That's why I asked in the Great Hall. I wanted the question on record before anyone could make the evidence disappear. Hermione stared at him for a long moment. Something happened in her expression, not the classification she'd been doing, but something slower and more genuine, the expression of someone recalibrating what they thought was possible. You planned all of this, she said. I planned for this possibility. Harry corrected. There's a difference. I hoped I was wrong. He looked down at his untouched plate. I wasn't. You're 11, Neville said faintly. Yes, Harry agreed. Down the table, the twins had abandoned their pea catapult entirely and were watching Harry with matching expressions that Harry categorized as delighted admiration, the kind reserved for someone who has done something irreversible in a very interesting way. The taller one caught Harry's eye and raised his goblet in a small, private salute. Harry nodded back. McGonagall came to the Gryffindor table 40 minutes later, moving through the noise of the gradually resuming feast with the contained urgency of someone who has been waiting for the correct moment, and has decided this is it. She stopped behind Harry's chair, and Harry turned to look up at her. She looked different up close. He'd seen her at the front of the room, crisp and precise, running the sorting with the efficiency of someone who's done it many times. Up close she looked older, and the oldness wasn't about her face. It was in the way she was standing, a quality of carried weight. Mr. Potter, she said quietly, pitched for him alone. The headmaster has asked me to escort you to his office. I'd rather not go without a witness, Harry said. Or a staff member I trust. I am a staff member. Yes, Harry said. But I watched your face when I mentioned the cupboard. McGonagall's jaw tightened again, that specific tension he noticed from across the room. Which means, Harry said, without any cruelty in it, that you already knew, which means you have a complicated relationship with this situation, which means you're not quite the right choice. He paused. No offense. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was far too intricate to classify in the way he usually classified adults' expressions. There were at least 4 things happening in it simultaneously. Mr. Potter, she said at last very quietly. Where did you come from? Privet Drive, Harry said, and stood up, and looked around the great hall. Who would I trust enough to accompany me to Dumbledore's office? I've known everyone here for approximately 2 hours. He considered that seriously, scanning the tables. That's a problem I'm going to have to solve quickly. I'll go with you. The voice came from his right. Hermione. She was standing up, her hands flat on the table, with an expression that said she had made a decision and the decision was final and anyone arguing with it should save their time. Harry looked at her. Thought about it. You've been trying to decide since the test whether loyalty to authority or loyalty to evidence is the right call. You just decided. Evidence wins, Hermione said. It always should. That's useful to know, Harry said, and nodded once, and turned back to McGonagall. Hermione will come. And I'd like to speak with someone from outside the school before I go in, a neutral party. Is there any chance, he said, with perfect composure, of reaching the Hogwarts school governors tonight? McGonagall closed her eyes for one measured second. It's your first night, she said. I know, Harry said. I'm sorry about the timing. She opened her eyes. And despite everything, despite the tight jaw, the complicated expression, the visible weight she was carrying, something moved through her face that wasn't quite a smile. It was something with more edges than a smile. Something that belonged to a woman who had spent decades watching children arrive at a school she loved and leave as something less than what they should have been. No, you're not, she said. No, Harry agreed. I'm not. She led them toward the door. The Great Hall watched them go, and the feast noise that had slowly been rebuilding fell away again in their wake, the students at every table turning to watch a small dark-haired boy with round glasses and a scar on his forehead walk out of his first Hogwarts feast with his chin level and his stride steady, and exactly the right amount of purpose in every step. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy watched Harry until the doors closed, and then turned to look at the head table, where Dumbledore had settled back into his chair and was studying the middle distance with the expression of a man revising several years of planning. At the Hufflepuff table, a second-year girl with sharp eyes and quick hands had already started writing something on a napkin that she intended to turn into a letter. In the enchanted ceiling, a storm was building. The corridor outside the Great Hall was dim and cold, torches spaced wide enough that there were real shadows between them, and for a moment the three of them, McGonagall, Harry, and Hermione, who was walking slightly behind Harry's shoulder with the posture of someone who has decided to be a witness, stood in the quiet while the distant noise of the feast pushed through the heavy oak doors. The governors, McGonagall said, and her voice had changed now that they were out of the Great Hall, had shed the public precision and become something more direct. Harry. The Board of Governors is not, they're not straightforward allies. Several of them have interests that align closely with those of certain families. Which families? Harry asked. Malfoy, she said, and something crossed her face. Not Parkinson. The older families with ministry connections. So they might be more help or less help depending on whether Dumbledore's methods serve or threaten those families, Harry said. Which means I need to understand those interests before I make contact. He was walking while he talked, which surprised McGonagall enough that she had to speed up to keep pace. What I actually want tonight is documentation. A written record of what happened in the Great Hall, witnessed by at least 3 parties. The food I didn't eat still on the table. Testimony from anyone willing to give it. He glanced at her. Can I access the school records room? The records, Harry, those are restricted to. Is there a precedent for student access to records pertaining to their own person? McGonagall went quiet. Because if there is, Harry said, I'd like to invoke it tonight. Before the records are adjusted. Hermione made a sound that was almost a laugh and immediately suppressed it. You think he'd falsify records? McGonagall said. I think that a man who put 39 loyalty potions in an 11-year-old's food will not be stopped from tidying up paperwork by moral scruple alone, Harry said. He stopped walking and looked up at McGonagall with clear eyes. I don't think he's evil. I want to be precise about that. I think he has a plan, and the plan seemed worth it to him, and he's not going to abandon it because I asked a question in the Great Hall. He paused. He's going to manage this. The question is whether I let him. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment in the torchlight, and the weight he noticed at the table was very visible now, the way she was standing with it, the way it had settled into her shoulders over years. I have known, she said slowly, for some time that the arrangements made for your upbringing were not what I had advocated for. You advocated against it? I wrote a report, she said, on the day you were placed. I noted my concerns about the family selected and recommended that alternatives be explored. What happened to the report? It was filed, she said, by the headmaster. Harry nodded. And you let it go. It wasn't an accusation. He said it the same way he said everything, as a fact being placed on the table. But McGonagall took a breath through her nose that suggested she was absorbing something. I let it go, she confirmed. Right, Harry said. And then, precisely because he was not the kind of person who left people bleeding unnecessarily. You're not letting it go now. She looked at him. Come on, Harry said, and turned back down the corridor. Let's get to the records room before anyone thinks to lock it. Hermione, you'll need to remember what you've heard tonight exactly as it happened. Can you do that? I have an eidetic memory for written and spoken text, Hermione said promptly. I've had it since I was 6. Brilliant, Harry said. We'll need it. The torches flickered as they walked, throwing their shadows long and angular on the stone walls, and somewhere above them the enchanted storm in the great hall's ceiling finally broke open and the rain came down in perfectly controlled sheets that soaked nothing but looked absolutely spectacular. The records room was 3 floors up, behind a door that unlocked for McGonagall's wand and revealed itself to be much larger on the inside than it had any right to be, given the staircase outside. It smelled of aged parchment, and something faintly metallic, and the shelves ran floor to ceiling, 20 feet, with wheeled ladders on brass rails and thousands of labeled files organized by year, by subject, by the kind of bureaucratic precision that only happens in institutions that have been doing things the same way for centuries. Harry walked to the nearest index cabinet, opened it, and found the H section in 40 seconds. "Potter Harry James," he said, pulling the folder. It was thick, much thicker than any first-year student's folder had any right to be, given that the school year had started approximately 2.5 hours ago. He opened it on the reading table and spread the contents. Hermione was immediately beside him, reading. "Placement documentation," she said, pointing. "Signed by Dumbledore. Dated the 3rd of November, 1981. She paused. "2 days after your parents, 2 days," Harry said. He was reading quickly, scanning with the efficient speed of someone who had taught himself to read everything available in the Dursleys' house just to have something. "Placement at number 4, Privet Drive. Guardian, Petunia Dursley, née Evans. Protective enchantments, here, blood wards anchor to emotional environment." He looked up. "The blood wards are real. The protection is real. That's not fabricated." He kept reading. "But this," he pointed. "Monitoring charm. Active from 1981. Passive recording of emotional state. Compliance markers?" McGonagall leaned over his shoulder and read, and went very still. "He was monitoring whether I was compliant," Harry said. Not angry. He'd passed anger somewhere around the time the vial went dark green, and what was on the other side of it was colder and more useful. He was tracking whether the environment was producing the right. He stopped. "Read a specific line again." Then again. "Subject emotional baseline appropriate for gratitude receptive psychological profile." Hermione read aloud, her voice going flat. "Pre-existing framework of low self-worth predicted to generate high response to affirmation from designated authority figure." She stopped reading. The room was quiet. That's clinical," Harry said. "Yes." He folded the relevant documents carefully, 6 pages, and looked at McGonagall. "I'll need these witnessed and copied before they disappear." "Harry," McGonagall said, and her voice had none of its precision left. "I didn't know about this. I knew the placement was imperfect. I didn't know there was. I didn't know he was watching for I know," Harry said. He looked at her steadily. "If you'd known, you'd have done something. I actually believe that." He picked up the folder. "That's why I told you about the cupboard. I needed to see whether you already knew. You didn't." He paused. "That makes you useful?" Hermione made a small sound. "That came out wrong," Harry said. "I meant trustworthy. Trustworthy and useful. It did come out wrong." Hermione agreed. "I'm working on people skills," Harry said, and picked up the folder, and looked at the shelf in front of him, thousands of files, hundreds of years of institutional record, and thought about everything that was in this room that Dumbledore had assumed no one would bother to read on a Tuesday night in September. "I'm going to need more time in here," he said. "How much time?" McGonagall asked. Harry thought about it. "Do you have a chair?" It was past midnight when they finished. Hermione had developed a system for organizing documents by category, had produced a list of references in a careful hand that would have been remarkable even without the context that she had written it in a candlelit records room on her first night of school, and had not once complained or asked to go to bed, which told Harry something important about her. McGonagall had produced a chair. She sat in it for the first hour, reading documents as Harry found them, making sounds that ranged from controlled to not, and by the second hour had acquired a piece of parchment of her own and was making notes in the tight, precise handwriting of someone who has been choosing their words carefully for 40 years and is currently choosing not to. Harry read everything with both eyes and his full attention, and filed each thing in the correct place in his mind, the mind that Petunia had called unnatural and Dudley had called weird and Harry had just called his own. At 12:30, he organized the copied documents, thanked McGonagall for the chair, and stood up. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to need to talk to someone who knows ministry procedure for filing formal complaints against school administration. Do you know anyone outside Hogwarts who might help?" McGonagall looked at him across the reading table with the expression that she'd had in the corridor, the complex one with 4 things in it simultaneously, and said, "There is a woman at the Department of Magical Law. Amelia Bones. She has a niece in your year. I believe the niece is in Hufflepuff." "Bones," Harry repeated, storing it. "Thank you." He walked to the door. Paused. Looked back. "Professor McGonagall," he said. "The report you wrote. The one about the family selection. Can I have a copy of it?" She looked at him for a very long time. "Yes," she said. "I'll find it tonight." Harry nodded. Opened the door. Looked at Hermione, who was standing in the corridor already, documents tucked under her arm like she'd been carrying classified files her whole life. "Good first day?" Harry asked. Hermione thought about it seriously, the way she seemed to think about everything. "Instructive," she said. "Yeah," Harry agreed, and they walked back through the quiet castle toward Gryffindor Tower, and the torches burned behind them, and somewhere in the headmaster's office a very old man with half-moon glasses sat in a high-backed chair and looked out at the night sky and thought about the fact that the 11-year-old boy he had spent a decade preparing had, in the space of 4 hours, read the potion's index, constructed a testing solution, produced a decoy envelope, accessed the school records, identified the monitoring charms, copied the documentation, and turned Minerva McGonagall. He thought about this for a long time. Then he reached for a piece of parchment, and began to write. Chapter 2. The Appetite of Wolves. The Gryffindor common room at 7 in the morning smelled like burnt toast and ambition. Harry had been awake since 5. He'd watched the sky outside the dormitory windows shift from black to gray to a pale, watery gold that made the lake look like hammered tin, and he'd spent the time doing what he always did with empty hours, thinking, organizing, running through what he knew and what he needed to know and the gap between the two, which was still considerable but smaller than it had been 24 hours ago. He'd slept 3 hours. It was enough. He'd learned to run on less in the Dursleys' house, where early mornings meant breakfast preparation and the quiet before Dudley woke up, and those 2 hours before the household lurched into noise had always been his. The best thinking time. The time when you could hear yourself. His dormitory roommates, Neville, a stocky boy named Seamus Finnegan who'd fallen asleep mid-sentence, and a quiet dark-skinned boy named Dean Thomas who read football magazines with the focused reverence of a monk studying scripture, had all been asleep by the time Harry had come back from the records room. Neville had stirred when Harry sat on his bed and begun sorting documents, opened one eye, looked at the stack of parchment, said, "Did it go okay?" in a voice blurred with sleep, and then fallen back unconscious before Harry could answer. He liked Neville already. The question had mattered more than the answer. By 6:30 he had the documents organized into 3 sets. The first was the material most useful for any formal complaint, the placement authorization with Dumbledore's signature, and the monitoring charm records, the food preparation logs he'd found in a sub-file under school administration, and McGonagall's original placement objection report, which she had left outside the dormitory door sometime in the night in a plain sealed envelope with no note attached. The second set was context, the broader picture of decisions made around Harry's life, the framework of plans he was still assembling piece by piece. The third set was questions. Things he'd found that opened doors he hadn't known were there. He was reading through the third set when Hermione came downstairs. She was already fully dressed, hair still damp, and she was carrying her own copy of the notes she'd made the night before, which she had apparently rewritten in the small hours into a cleaner and better organized version, because Hermione Granger approached information the way other people approach territory. She improved it, and then defended it. She sat across from him in the armchairs by the fire, which was burning at its morning low, and held out her reorganized notes. "I added a section on the compound loyalty potion delivery mechanism," she said. "I found a reference in Intermediate Potions. It was in my trunk, I brought it from home, that confirms the 39-dose reading would require pre-planned sequential preparation. It can't happen by accident. Someone had to specifically brew the compounds in that quantity, specifically designed for your individual magical signature." Harry took the notes, read the relevant section, and felt something settle in him with a quiet, firm click. "Your individual magical signature," he said. "Which means they'd need a sample of your magic to calibrate to." "Yes. They'd need a sample of my magic," Harry said. He set down the notes. "When did they get a sample of my magic? I didn't know I was a wizard until a month ago. I've never deliberately performed." He stopped. Restarted. "How are magical signatures logged?" "At birth," Hermione said. She'd clearly already looked this up. "At St. Mungo's. They do a standard magical signature recording for every magical child born in Britain. It goes into a central registry." She paused. "The registry is managed by the Ministry. Specifically, the Department of Magical Records, which operates under the Wizarding Administration Services, which ultimately reports to the Minister," Harry said. "Or whoever has influence over the Minister." He looked at her. "So someone with the right access could pull my signature from the registry at any point after my birth?" "Yes. And Dumbledore has that kind of access." Hermione met his eyes. "Based on what we found last night, I think it's reasonable to say he has most kinds of access." Harry leaned back in his chair and looked at the fire. The common room was starting to fill up, older students coming down in various stages of readiness, most of them stopping when they saw Harry, doing a visible recalibration, then sitting somewhere with a clear line of sight to him. He'd noticed this pattern starting at the feast, and it hadn't stopped. He was being watched, which was fine. Being watched was manageable. Being watched was, in many ways, useful. "We need to move fast," he said. "He had last night to think. He's had since midnight to make decisions. Whatever he's planning to do about this, it started hours ago. What do you think he'll do?" Harry thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything, without assumptions, from the available evidence outward. "He'll try to reframe. The public accusation can't be undone, so he'll need a story that absorbs it. Something that makes what he did sound reasonable. Protective." He tilted his head. "He'll also want to talk to me alone, which is why I'm not going anywhere alone today." "I'll stay with you," Hermione said, with the same flat finality she'd deployed at the feast. "I know," Harry said, and meant it as a compliment. The portrait hole swung open and the two red-haired twins extracted themselves from it with the practiced ease of people who have been climbing through portrait holes since they could walk. They were taller than Harry had clocked at the feast, Fred and George Weasley, third years, identical right down to the same gleam of mischievous calculation that they were currently both directing at Harry. The one on the left, Fred, or possibly George, Harry hadn't cracked the distinction yet, said, "There he is. The boy who asked Dumbledore an actual question," said the one on the right. "To his face. In the Great Hall. On night 1. They sat down on the sofa nearest his chair with the comfort of people claiming territory they'd already decided was theirs. "We've been doing things to annoy Dumbledore for 3 years," said one of them. Harry was going to call him Fred until proven otherwise. "Swamp sliming the second-floor corridor. The self-singing choir robes. The portrait that recites embarrassing things about whoever looks at it. Elaborate and beautiful operations," said the other one. "And none of them," Fred said, "came anywhere close to what you did last night with a piece of parchment and a speech." "It wasn't a speech," Harry said. "What was it then?" "Questions," Harry said. "With documentation." Fred and George exchanged a look that communicated something complex and fond. "We like him," George said. "We've decided," Fred confirmed. "I'm flattered," Harry said genuinely. He looked at them both carefully. "How well do you know the castle? The parts that aren't in the official layout?" Both twins went very still, in the way that people go still when they've been asked the precise right question. "Reasonably well," Fred said, with tremendous understatement. "I need to be somewhere by 7:50 that isn't the main corridors. Is there a route from Gryffindor Tower to the first floor corridor that avoids the moving staircases and the portraits near the headmaster's office?" George blinked. "Why the portraits near? They report to him," Harry said. "I noticed last night. The portrait of Nicomedes the Navigable near the third floor watched me walk back from the records room and immediately turned to say something to the portrait beside him. I don't know the range on the network, but I'd rather not test it this morning." Fred and George looked at each other for a long time. "Right," said Fred. "Yes," said George. "We're keeping him," they said together. Breakfast in the Great Hall had an energy like the morning after a thunderstorm, everything washed clean and new and slightly electric. Students who had been at the feast were briefing students who hadn't been, which meant that the second and third years were getting second-hand accounts of varying accuracy, and by the time Harry came in through the side entrance Fred had shown him, the basic story had apparently propagated far enough that several Hufflepuffs started nudging each other urgently as he sat down. He ignored it. He had learned a long time ago that the best response to being stared at was to have something more interesting to do than notice it. He pulled out his copy of the complaint documentation and read through it one more time while Hermione poured tea for both of them with the automatic efficiency of someone who has older siblings and has absorbed logistics by proximity. Neville had found them. He always seemed to navigate to Harry with a kind of reliable homing instinct, and was eating toast and watching the head table. "Dumbledore's not here yet," Neville said. "I noticed. Neither is Snape." Harry looked up. The head table had most of its usual occupants. Quirrell was there, looking like a man who had not slept and was reconsidering several professional decisions, and Flitwick was eating a remarkably large breakfast for such a small man, and Professor Sprout was reading what appeared to be a pamphlet about mandrakes. But the headmaster's chair was empty, and Snape's, and McGonagall's, and the chair belonging to a thin, nervous-looking witch Harry didn't have a name for yet. "3 missing," Hermione said, clearly having already registered this. "Staff meeting," Harry said. "Probably about last night." He put the documents away. "Good. Let them talk. The more they debated among themselves, the more versions of the conversation exist, and the harder it is to present a single unified story to the school." "You want them divided," Hermione said. "I want the truth to have enough room to exist," Harry said. "That's different." Neville chewed his toast. "What do we do in the meantime?" "Classes," Harry said. "We go to every single class, we are engaged and prepared, and we give absolutely no one any grounds to say that what happened last night was a disruption caused by an unstable student." He looked at Neville. "What have you got first period?" "Transfiguration." "McGonagall," Harry said. He'd memorized the schedule the previous night. "Good. Keep your eyes open in there. She's working something out. She made a decision last night, and I want to know where she lands." "You're asking me to spy on a teacher," Neville said in a tone of great uncertainty. "I'm asking you to pay attention," Harry said. "Which is a thing you should do in Transfiguration regardless." Neville considered this. "That's technically true. I'll be in charms first," Hermione said, pulling out her timetable with the air of someone who has had it memorized since receiving it but is confirming for the group's benefit. "Then herbology. Then history of magic." "History of magic is Binns," Harry said. "He won't have been at the feast. Ask him something procedural about school historical records and see what he says. Ghosts sometimes have access to institutional memory that goes deeper than the written files." Hermione looked at him. "That is a very good idea." "Thank you." "You're welcome." She paused. "It's strange that you're good at this." I'm good at it because I've had to be," Harry said simply. The great hall doors opened and Dumbledore walked in. He was smiling. He was always smiling. But Harry had spent enough time watching the way smiles functioned, how Petunia's smiles operated differently at the front door versus at the kitchen table, how a smile with forward momentum was different from a smile that was a position, and this one was the second kind. Dumbledore walked to his chair at the head table with his beard and his robes and his particular quality of filling a space, and he sat down, and he looked up and found Harry across the length of the hall. Harry looked back. Either of them moved. It lasted 3 seconds, and then Dumbledore reached for a piece of toast, and Harry picked up his tea, and that was the beginning of what would turn out to be a very interesting first day of school. McGonagall's Transfiguration class began with a speech about the precision and discipline required by the subject, delivered in a voice that had its full professional precision restored, which Harry had expected. She was not going to let last night into the classroom. That was a reasonable choice and also a telling one. What people keep out of rooms tells you as much as what they let in. What she could not keep out was the quality of her attention when she demonstrated the match-to-needle transformation. She did it with the same clean efficiency she brought to everything, but Harry, watching from the third row, noticed that when she set the needle down and looked at the class, her eyes moved to him a fraction of a second before they moved to anyone else. She was checking on him. Not managing him. Checking. He decided that was a point in her column. He did the transformation correctly on his third attempt, which was 3 attempts fewer than everyone else in the room including Hermione, who got it on her 6th and looked simultaneously pleased and annoyed. McGonagall marked it in her register without comment but with a quality of careful note-taking that suggested she was filing it somewhere. After class, as the others filed out into the corridor where the smell of the stone was different in the daytime, less cold, more occupied, Harry stayed by the desk. McGonagall looked up from her register. "The report you left," Harry said. "Thank you." She set her quill down. "It was what I had. I wish it were more. It confirms a timeline," Harry said. "That's useful." He paused. "The staff meeting this morning. Can you tell me what position Dumbledore is taking?" McGonagall's expression tightened in the way that was specific to people navigating loyalty conflicts. "Harry, I don't need specifics," Harry said. "I just need to know whether he's treating this as a crisis to manage or a misunderstanding to correct." She looked at him for a moment. "He called it," she said carefully, "a premature revelation of a complex protective strategy that has been mischaracterized due to a student's understandable lack of contextual understanding." "Right," Harry said. "So crisis management." "Yes." "Did anyone disagree with that characterization?" She paused. Severus said, and I am quoting precisely, "That characterization will not survive contact with anyone who knows what loyalty potions are." Harry almost smiled. And Dumbledore's response? He said that he had every confidence in the school community's capacity for nuanced interpretation of complex magical protocols. Which means he's betting that the institutional weight of his reputation will outrun the facts, Harry said. He picked up his bag. "I need one more thing, Professor. Who in the ministry handles formal complaints against school administrators? And who among them would have no political reason to sit on the complaint?" McGonagall folded her hands on her desk. She had the look of someone watching a river change course in real time. "Amelia Bones," she said. "I mentioned her last night." "You did? And she's genuinely independent?" "She is the most genuinely independent person in the current ministry," McGonagall said, with the precise tone of someone who means this as both a compliment and a warning. "She is also deeply difficult, and she will ask you questions that are harder than anything Dumbledore asked last night, and she will not accept I read the potions index on the train as a sufficient explanation for anything." "I like difficult questions," Harry said. McGonagall looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I rather thought you might." She opened her desk drawer and took out a small card, which she turned over in her fingers for a moment before setting it on the desk between them. "Her office address," She prefers correspondence by owl to formal channels. Formal channels pass through 3 gatekeepers before reaching her desk. Harry took the card. Go to your next class, McGonagall said, and her voice had its precision back, but there was something underneath it that was less careful and more real. And Harry, be careful today. With Dumbledore? With everyone, she said. What you started last night, people will want to use it. Some of them will seem like allies and some of them will be. The problem is that the 2 groups look identical from the outside. Harry nodded. He'd already known this. It was good to have confirmation. Charms was taught by Professor Flitwick, who stood on a stack of books to see over his desk, and whose enthusiasm for magic had the quality of something genuine and long maintained, the enthusiasm of someone who loved their subject before it was their subject, the way Hermione loved books. He greeted the class with real warmth, and kept it businesslike once the greetings were done, which Harry appreciated. He didn't mention the feast. He didn't look at Harry differently than he looked at anyone else. That put him in a separate column from most of the adults Harry had encountered so far. Double Potions was in the dungeon. Harry had thought about this class specifically. Of all the subjects he was taking, Potions was the one where he'd already done the most advanced work. The compendium was just the beginning. He'd gotten his hands on 2 additional texts in Diagon Alley and worked through both of them in the 3 weeks between buying his supplies and term starting. He'd done this for the same reason he made the testing vials. Because if loyalty potions were involved, Potions was the subject most likely to be weaponized against him, and he'd rather understand the weapon before anyone pointed it at him. Snape walked into the classroom like he owned the dungeon, which in practical terms he did, and swept his gaze across the class with the evaluative coldness of someone who doesn't bother pretending to be warmer than he is. His eyes moved over the Gryffindors and Slytherins arranged on opposite sides of the room. Harry had chosen a bench in the middle, slightly off-center, with Hermione on his left and an empty seat on his right that remained empty because no one wanted to sit in the ambiguous middle zone, which suited him perfectly, and stopped on Harry for exactly as long as they stopped on anyone else, which was not at all. There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class, Snape said, and proceeded to deliver what was evidently a speech he'd given before, about the subtle science and exact art of potion-making, and Harry listened to every word with close attention because the speech was telling him things, and the things it was telling him were more interesting than the words being used. Snape was, among the faculty, the person most directly in the line of fire from what had happened last night. He had publicly told Dumbledore to answer Harry's question. He had not retracted this in the staff meeting, based on McGonagall's account. He was a spy. Harry had gathered enough from the documents to know that Snape's history was complicated in ways that meant he lived permanently in the space between factions, and yet he had, for one very specific moment in the Great Hall, stepped to Harry's side. Why? Harry needed to know why. Potter, Snape said, pausing in his circuit of the room. He had the delivery of someone who had decided to make this moment, and had prepared it accordingly. Our new celebrity. He looked down at Harry with eyes that were cold in the specific way of people who have decided coldness is the safest setting. Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? The class went still in the way that classes go still when they sense something incoming. Harry had read about asphodel and wormwood the previous Thursday. He'd cross-referenced the combination in the compendium and in 1,000 magical herbs and fungi because the combination was unusual enough to notice, and noticing unusual things was what he did. Asphodel and wormwood make draught of living death, Harry said. One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. The specific variant using powdered asphodel root rather than the blossom produces a deeper stasis. He paused. The asphodel is associated with deep regret and death in both Muggle mythology and early wizarding symbolism. The wormwood is bitter and associated with grief. The combination has been noted by several potion historians as not just chemically significant, but almost deliberately mournful in composition. Slughorn's commentary in advanced potion making suggests the original brewer may have had personal reasons for the naming. He met Snape's eyes. Were you testing whether I'd done the reading, or whether I'd done the subtext? The classroom was absolutely silent. Hermione had stopped breathing. Snape looked at Harry. His expression had not moved, which was itself significant. Harry had learned to read the absence of reaction as carefully as reactions, because controlled faces only stay controlled when they're working at it. Where? Snape said very precisely. Would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? The stomach of a goat, Harry said. It's an antidote to most poisons. Historically significant for a wide range of applications, though it's been mostly replaced in modern practice by specific counteragents because a bezoar's efficacy degrades with the sophistication of the poison. Most poisons, Snape repeated. Most, Harry confirmed. Including loyalty compounds. He said it without any inflection. A flat statement in the middle of a potions class, addressed to a room of 11-year-olds who were mostly old enough to understand exactly what had been said. At the Slytherin side of the room, Draco had gone very still. At Harry's bench, Hermione made an almost inaudible sound. No, Harry said. Loyalty compounds aren't standard poisons. A bezoar won't handle them. You'd need a specific counteragent built from the base compound, which would require a sample of the original preparation, which, interestingly, I still have. He kept his voice as flat as Snape's. The testing vial retained approximately 2 milliliters of the compound. Enough to build a counteragent from. Snape looked at him for 4 seconds. 10 points to Gryffindor, he said, and moved on. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy looked at the back of Snape's robes with an expression that was half confusion and half something that might have been recalculation. Lunch was brief and strategic. Harry ate from the serving dishes that had been brought from the main kitchen as commons rather than anything from the preset arrangements, and he watched who came to talk to him and in what order, because the order in which people approach you after a significant event tells you who's been managing the decision versus who'd made it themselves. The first person was a Hufflepuff second-year named Justin Finch-Fletchley, who sat down with the specific brightness of someone with excellent social instincts who had decided Harry was worth knowing. He chatted easily, asked smart questions, and left without asking for anything directly, which meant he was either genuine or very good. The second was a girl Harry hadn't spoken to, small, round-faced, with the kind of neatness that came from caring about small things. Hannah Abbott, also Hufflepuff, who sat down across from Harry and said, without preamble, "My mum says the loyalty potions and food thing happened to someone at Beauxbatons 3 years ago. The governor's board had the staff member sacked. There was a case in the French magical courts." She set a folded clipping on the table. "I found it in the library this morning. Thought you might want it." Harry looked at the clipping. It was from the Revue de Magie, French Wizarding Press, dated 1988. He picked it up and read it in approximately 40 seconds. "Thank you," he said, meaning it precisely and completely. "I thought evidence was probably helpful," Hannah said, with the slight blush of someone who has done something they weren't sure about. "Evidence is always helpful," Harry said. He folded the clipping and put it with his documents. "What's your name?" "Hannah Abbott." "Thank you, Hannah." She went back to the Hufflepuff table with her chin slightly higher than when she'd arrived. "She spent her whole morning in the library," Hermione said, watching her go. "I saw her when I was in there for History of Magic Resources. She checked out 4 volumes on magical consent law. I noticed she didn't ask for anything in return," Harry said. "Is that significant?" "Everyone who comes to talk to me wants something," Harry said. "Information, affiliation, a claim on whichever side wins. Which is fine, that's how social networks form. But people who do things without an obvious claim are either very good-hearted or playing a much longer game." "She's a second-year Hufflepuff," Hermione said. "Probably very good-hearted," Harry agreed. The third person who came was not a student. Professor Quirrell arrived at the Gryffindor table from the side, not the front, moving along the wall with the slightly sideways trajectory of a man who was aware that his approach was being noted and was trying to mitigate this by being indirect about it, which achieved the opposite of its intended effect because indirect approaches are more noticeable, not less. He stopped beside Harry and said, with his characteristic stammer, "Mr. Peapotter, the headmaster would very much appreciate a moment of your tea time this afternoon. I'm happy to meet with the headmaster," Harry said pleasantly. "In a formal scheduled meeting, with Professor McGonagall and at least one parent or guardian equivalent present, as is standard procedure for any meeting between a minor and school administration in cases involving potential safeguarding concerns." He looked up at Quirrell. "I found that in the school charter. Section 12, paragraph 4. I can send him the relevant passage if that would help." Quirrell opened and closed his mouth twice. "The school charter?" he managed. "Records room," Harry said. "Last night. I read the relevant sections." He went back to his lunch. "Please tell the headmaster I look forward to the scheduled meeting." Quirrell left in the direction he'd come from, walking slightly faster than he'd arrived. "The school charter has a section on safeguarding meetings?" Hermione said. "It does now," Harry said. "Well, it always did, technically. It was in the administrative bylaws from 1842. I don't think anyone's referenced it in about 70 years. He paused. "It's quite clear, though." Hermione stared at him. "You read the 1842 administrative bylaws?" "The relevant sections," Harry said. "I skimmed the rest." "You skimmed 184-year-old administrative bylaws." "Hermione," Harry said gently, "I grew up in a house where the only reading material in my room was a broken encyclopedia and a mold-damaged copy of the Water Board's annual report. I read both of them. Twice." He picked up his pumpkin juice, fresh from a communal pitcher, tested and clear, and took a drink. The bylaws were more interesting. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. "I would like you to know," she said, "that I find this simultaneously very sad and very impressive." "That's a reasonable response," Harry said. The afternoon brought two developments. The first was the owl. It arrived during the free period between herbology and dinner, dropping through the open tower window with the purposeful descent of a bird who knew exactly where it was going. A large tawny, not Harry's Hedwig, different bird. It landed on the arm of Harry's chair, extended its leg, and waited with the patience of a professionally employed animal. The letter was brief. Looping handwriting, ink a deep plum. "Mr. Potter, I have been made aware of the events of the previous evening at Hogwarts through channels I will not specify in writing. I would prefer to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Not through official channels. I will explain why when we speak. I can arrange a secured communication line through the Portrait Network if you have access, or alternatively through an intermediary I trust absolutely. I hope this letter finds you well, and I note with interest that you found your way to Section 12, Paragraph 4 before your second day of school. A. Bones Diamelli." Harry read it twice. "Set it down. Read it a third time." "Who's it from?" Hermione asked from across the study table. "Amelia Bones," Harry said. Hermione's head came up sharply. "The head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement?" "Yes." "She contacted you?" "She found out about last night," Harry said, and then stopped, and thought about that more carefully. The letter had arrived in the early afternoon, less than 24 hours after the feast. For it to have arrived this quickly, Bones would have had to receive information this morning, write a letter, and have it delivered, all in the space of perhaps 5 hours. "Who told her?" "She said channels she won't specify," Hermione said. "She was contacted by someone who wanted her to know," Harry said. "Someone who has a reason to want the Department of Magical Law Enforcement aware and engaged before Dumbledore can define the narrative." He thought about who'd been in the Great Hall last night, who'd understood the implications quickly enough to act on them by the following morning, who had both the connection and the motivation. He thought about Snape, who had told Dumbledore to answer the question and whose motivation Harry still hadn't pinned down. He thought about the blond boy at the Slytherin table, who had watched Harry with an expression of someone revising a plan, whose father was on the Board of Governors, whose family had every reason to undermine Dumbledore's authority. He thought about several Ravenclaw 7th years who had been taking notes during the feast and whose head of house was Flitwick, who had treated Harry without any noticeable difference from anyone else this morning, which could mean he was uninterested or could mean he was very careful. He couldn't know yet. He filed it. "I'll respond," he said. "Ask if she can arrange a communication through someone at the school she trusts. If she suggests McGonagall, that tells me she's been briefed adequately. If she suggests someone else, that tells me something different." He wrote back briefly, folded the letter, and sent the tawny on its way. The second development arrived not by owl but by feet, specifically the controlled, deliberate footsteps of Draco Malfoy, who came into the Gryffindor common room through the portrait hole, which caused an immediate ripple of outrage among 4 older students near the door, and crossed the room to where Harry was sitting with the social confidence of someone who has decided that rules apply to other people. "You can't be in here," said a fifth-year boy from near the fireplace. "I'm aware," Draco said, without looking at him. He stopped in front of Harry's chair. "I'd like a conversation." Harry looked at him. He'd thought about Draco since the feast, not extensively, but enough to have a preliminary read. The public performance was pure Malfoy family construction, the accent and posture and casual superiority assembled like armor by a family that believed presentation was power. Underneath it, Harry had caught something less legible. Uncertainty, maybe? Or something more interesting, the expression of someone whose instructions no longer fit the situation. "About?" Harry said. "About what you're doing," Draco said. "And whether you've considered all the variables." "Sit down," Harry said. Another ripple from the fireplace direction. The fifth year looked like he was building toward an objection. Draco sat. "The Board of Governors," Draco said, lowering his voice. Not because he was afraid, his voice had none of the quality of fear in it. He was lowering it for the same reason Harry lowered his in the Great Hall. Because privacy was power. "My father is on the board. He has been waiting for a specific kind of leverage against Dumbledore for 3 years. What you did last night is not leverage for your father," Harry said. Draco blinked. "I'm offering you an alliance with, you're offering me your father's agenda with a ribbon on it," Harry said. "Which is not the same thing. I know your father wants Dumbledore out. I suspect he wants Dumbledore out specifically because Dumbledore stands between him and a different kind of influence over this school. If I use your father's connection to the board, I trade one managed situation for another." He watched Draco's face carefully. "That's not why I'm doing this." "Then why?" Draco said slowly. "Are you doing this?" "Because he put 39 loyalty potions in my food," Harry said, with a simplicity that cut through the room's background noise, "and arranged my childhood to produce a specific psychological profile, and thought I wouldn't notice." He met Draco's eyes. "I noticed." Draco was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone sorting through what they'd expected to find and adjusting for what they'd found instead. "You're not looking to replace him with someone else," Draco said. "No. You want the whole structure changed." "I want the parts of the structure that allow this to happen changed," Harry said. "Those aren't the same thing either. I'm not an anarchist. I just think that adult authority over children should come with accountability." He looked at Draco steadily. "Which, interestingly, would also protect you." Draco's expression did something complex. "I don't need protection. Your father has specific plans for your life," Harry said. "The same way Dumbledore had specific plans for mine. I don't know the details. But I notice you came in here alone, without his knowledge, to find out what I'm doing before you decide what to tell him about it." He paused. "That's not the behavior of someone who's entirely comfortable with the plan." Draco said nothing. His face had gone very still. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Harry said. "I'm telling you what I told everyone last night. I'm not going to be managed. If you can work with that, there might be a conversation worth having. If your father's interests are the ceiling on that conversation, then we're probably done." Draco sat with that for 3 seconds. 5. 10. "The board meeting," he said at last. "My father is calling one. He'll have sent the formal request this morning. It takes 7 days for the full board to convene, but he can call an emergency session in 48 hours if he can get 3 other members to sign. Will he get 3 signatures? He'd already have 2, Draco said. The third is Griselda Marchbanks. She's 89, she doesn't like my father, and she's been on the board since before Dumbledore was appointed. He paused. She also has extremely strong opinions about the magical consent rights of minors, which she has been attempting to have enshrined in formal board policy for the last decade. Why are you telling me this? Harry asked. Draco looked at him, and the constructed armor of his face had a crack in it that was either genuine or extremely well performed, and Harry couldn't yet determine which. Because I want to see how you use it, Draco said. And because... He stopped. Started again. Because the Sorting Hat takes your measure the moment it touches you. I know what mine said. He stood up, adjusting his robes. I imagine you were interesting, Potter. You must have been, for a Gryffindor to come out of you. He walked back to the portrait hole, nodded to the outraged fifth year with the specific graciousness of someone who knows they're winning, and climbed back out. The common room exhaled. Harry sat with the information about Griselda Marchbanks and the board and the 48-hour emergency session, and thought about how to use it, and how to use it correctly, and what the difference was. Then he started writing a letter. Who are you writing to now? Hermione asked. Griselda Marchbanks, Harry said. Hermione stared. You're writing a letter to a member of the Board of Governors. Someone needs to, Harry said. And I'd rather it be me than Lucius Malfoy. He wrote quickly and precisely, the way he did everything, no wasted words, no performance, just the relevant information in the right order. Can you check the phrasing on the 3rd paragraph? I want to make sure the Section 12 reference is cited correctly. Hermione took the letter. Read it. Made 2 small corrections with a precise hand. Gave it back. The citation is correct, she said. The tone is direct. Good, Harry said. Some people might find it abrasive. Marchbanks is 89, Harry said. She's been on that board since before Dumbledore was appointed. I think she's probably tired of people being indirect. He folded the letter. I'll send it with Hedwig tonight. Neville arrived from the direction of the dormitory with a small, thoughtful look on his face, the kind that meant he'd been thinking something through on his own and had arrived somewhere. I talked to the portrait, he said. The one near the common room entrance. The one of Barnabas the Boring. Harry looked at him. And? He said. And he was quite upset about it, actually, he went on for a while. He said that portraits receive specific instructions about what to report and to whom. And that those instructions can be updated. Neville sat down. He said the last update to his reporting instructions was 6 years ago. 6 years ago, Harry said. When I would have been 5. He didn't say who updated them, Neville said. He said he wasn't supposed to say. But he also said that he found the whole situation deeply irregular, and that if someone were to inquire through the proper institutional portrait committee. He produced a small scrap of parchment with a name written on it. He was very insistent about proper channels. Harry took the parchment. Read the name. The Portrait Committee, Hermione said. Do we even know if that exists? It's in the administrative bylaws, Harry said. 1842, Section 23. He stood up. We do have a lot to do, Harry, Neville said with the careful patience of someone choosing their words. Are you scared at all? Of any of this? Harry thought about it honestly. When the vial went past 12, he said, I was not scared. Something adjacent. The feeling of standing in a room and realizing the walls are paper. He looked at Neville. But paper walls are better than stone ones. Paper walls you can walk through. Neville turned this over. Nodded slowly, the way he nodded at things that made a particular kind of sense to him. I want to help, Neville said. Properly. Not just watching and carrying things. I want to actually help. Harry looked at him. The round face and the uncertain hands, and the boy who had been shaped by other people's expectations into someone who thought of himself as lesser. He thought about how the world had been treating Neville and what Neville was underneath all of that treatment, and the gap between the two was its own kind of injustice. "I know," Harry said. "I'm going to need you to. There's something specific I want you to do tomorrow." He paused. "It involves the greenhouses and Professor Sprout, and I need someone she already likes." Neville's expression shifted. The uncertainty didn't leave, but something came up beside it. Something more solid. "She likes me," he said. "She said I had a real talent for herbology." "I know," Harry said. "You do. I watched you in class." He picked up his letter to Marchbanks. "That talent is useful. More useful than you think." He said it without performance, without the careful calibration of encouragement for its own sake. He said it because it was true, and Neville heard the difference, and the thing that came up beside the uncertainty got a little more solid. Outside the tower windows, the sky had shifted to that specific shade of Scottish dust that looked like pewter and smelled like rain, and somewhere across the grounds, in a circular office high in the castle, a man with half-moon glasses was writing something with a great deal of care, and thinking about a boy who had, in less than 24 hours, turned a Transfiguration professor, identified a board contact, established a connection with the head of magical law enforcement, secured key documentation, mapped the portrait network, declined his first offer of alliance from the Malfoy family, and shown every sign of doing the same tomorrow. Dumbledore set down his quill. He looked at a small device on his desk, a spinning silver instrument that monitored the emotional state of one specific former student at number 4, Privet Drive, and noted that the indicator had gone still, which meant the monitoring charm had been disrupted or removed. Then he looked at a second instrument, newer, calibrated to a specific magical signature. That one was spinning very fast indeed. Chapter 3: What the Portraits Know. The Portrait Committee met on the second floor. Harry found this out at 6:15 in the morning by the simple method of asking Barnabas the Boring directly, which turned out to be the right approach because Barnabas, despite his name, had very strong feelings about institutional transparency, and was delighted to have someone ask. The committee convened in a small antechamber behind a tapestry near the charms corridor, accessible through a door that looked like a section of wall until you pressed the correct stone, which Barnabas described in exhaustive detail, while his painted neighbor, a witch stirring something in a brass pot, rolled her eyes with the frequency of someone who had been listening to Barnabas for several centuries and had opinions about it. Harry was there by 6:40, Hermione beside him, both of them carrying parchment. The portrait committee, as it turned out, was not a committee of people. It was a committee of portraits, specifically, the 5 oldest portraits in the castle, whose frames were hung in a semicircle on the antechamber walls, and who had been established by the founders as the institutional memory and oversight body for all enchanted portraiture within Hogwarts. The founding charter, which one of them recited from memory in approximately 14 seconds, established their authority as independent from the Headmaster's office and answerable only to the Board of Governors. This was useful. The 5 portraits were Dilys Derwent, a former headmistress who also had a copy at St. Mungo's and moved between frames with the ease of someone who had been doing it for 300 years, Phillida Spore, another former head, who was currently tending painted mandrakes in the corner of her frame with focused attention, Everard, an elderly wizard with an impressive grey beard who had been surveying Harry with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things and is classifying this as interesting. A portrait Harry didn't have a name for yet, a severe woman in Tudor dress who hadn't spoken, and a completely empty frame, which Dilys Derwent explained belonged to Phineas Nigellus Black, who was currently sulking in his other portrait at Grimmauld Place and refusing to come out, which was, apparently, a recurring situation. "We know why you're here," Dilys said. She had an Edinburgh accent and the directness of a woman who had run a hospital and a school and had therefore exhausted her patience for unnecessary preambles several lifetimes ago. "Barnabas sent word through the network last night. Can you tell me the scope of the headmaster's reporting instructions?" Harry said. "We can tell you the scope," Everard said. Because those instructions were logged with this committee when they were issued, as is constitutionally required. What we cannot tell you is that we approved them, because we did not. Harry looked at him. You didn't approve them? They were logged, Dilly said with a precision that was itself a statement. Logging is required. Approval is a separate process. The instructions were submitted to this committee in August of 1985. The committee filed an objection. The objection was noted by the headmaster's office. She paused. And then the headmaster's office did as it pleased, which is what the headmaster's office has generally done since 1971 in matters that fall into what it has chosen to characterize as administrative discretion. What did the instructions say? Harry asked. Active reporting on 37 students by name, Everard said. Including yourself, from the moment of your arrival. Reporting to cover, location tracking within the castle, emotional state assessments, quality and quantity of social interactions, any statements that might be relevant to. He read from a painted ledger. Strategic planning or protective operations. 37 students, Hermione said. Current students? Some were historical, Billy said. Several were graduated. But at the current time, the active list contains 11 names. She looked at Harry. Yours is first. Who else? Harry asked. That information would require a formal petition to the committee, the tutor woman said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was dry and flat, and completely certain of its own authority. Logged, filed, and responded to within 7 days. I can start the formal petition now, Harry said. You can't, the tutor woman said. Though I will note that the 7-day timeline is at committee discretion and may be expedited in cases involving safeguarding concerns, which this committee has already determined this case to contain. She looked at him with eyes that were painted but were, somehow, very sharp. My name is Apollonia Vance. I was headmistress from 1347 to 1389. I take institutional misconduct seriously. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it. He filed the formal petition. Hermione helped with the wording, which was archaic enough that it required both of them working on it together, and left the antechamber with 2 things: a documented record of the reporting instructions, signed by all 5 portraits, and a timeline showing that the committee's objection had been overridden by Dumbledore's office in 1985 and again in 1987 and again in 1989. The portrait of Barnabas, as they passed him on the way back to the main corridor, leaned out of his frame as far as the paint would allow and said, in a tone of great satisfaction, I told you proper channels. You did, Harry agreed. 40 years I have been saying this, Barnabas said, with the energy of a man who has finally found his audience. 40 years. The letter to Marchbanks had gone out with Hedwig at midnight, and by the time Harry came down to breakfast, Hedwig was back. The response was on a thick cream paper with the kind of density that said it was made by hand, and the handwriting was spidery and sharp in the way that belonged to people who have been writing for so long that their hand has developed its own opinions. Mr. Potter, I received your letter with considerable interest and no small degree of satisfaction. I am not unaware of the developments at Hogwarts, though I confess the specificity of your documentation surprised me. Section 12 is rarely cited. The 1842 bylaws are rarely cited at all. You have clearly done your preparation, which I appreciate, as I am not interested in being contacted by people who have not done their preparation. I will tell you 3 things plainly. First, I have been attempting to call an emergency board session regarding school administration oversight for 2 years and have been blocked on procedural grounds each time. An emergency session requires 3 board signatures besides my own. I have had 2 reliably for 18 months. Second, I received a request for a 3rd signature this morning from Lucius Malfoy. I have not responded, and I will not be signing anything Malfoy initiates. Third, if the request for an emergency session comes from the correct quarter, specifically, from a student or guardian invoking their rights under the 1842 student safeguarding provisions, which I understand you have already discovered, procedural grounds for blocking it are considerably more limited. You need not ally with Malfoy to use the board. You need only know how the board works. I will answer specific questions by return owl. I prefer short, direct questions. G. Marchbanks. Harry read it twice, set it down, and felt the particular satisfaction of a piece clicking into place. She's going to help, Hermione said, reading over his shoulder without apology, which was a Hermione-specific behavior Harry had already decided to simply accept. She wants to help, Harry said. She's been wanting to call this session for 2 years. We're the procedural key she didn't have. He picked up a piece of toast, tested clear, as the food had been since yesterday's dinner, which suggested that someone had quietly decided the experiment was over, and thought about what to ask her first. Can a student invoke the 1842 safeguarding provisions directly? Hermione asked. She specifically said student or guardian, Harry said. So yes. I just need to know the exact language. He was already writing. Short and direct. What does invoking the 1842 safeguarding provisions require, exactly, and who must be notified at the time of invocation? He sent Hedwig back out into the morning. Neville arrived at the table looking slightly nervous and slightly determined, which Harry had come to understand as Neville's pre-action expression. He had a copy of Harry's notes on the greenhouse angle tucked under his arm. Professor Sprout has an open greenhouse period before first class, Neville said. Students can go if they want extra time with the practical work. Go, Harry said. Ask her about mandrake cultivation records specifically. She maintains her own records independent of the school's general administration. I found the reference in the 1990 herbology curriculum notes. If food preparation at Hogwarts involves herbology components, and it does, the kitchens use school-grown ingredients, she may have records of unusual requisitions. Neville nodded, the nervousness shifting into something more like purpose. What specifically am I looking for? He asked. Any unusual requisition for bitterroot, Harry said. It's a base compound for several loyalty potion variants. It grows specifically in the school greenhouses, and Sprout's records would show if it was harvested in unusual quantities. He paused. Don't ask directly. Ask about the cultivation history, the harvest yields, anything she'll talk about naturally. Herbologists like to talk about their plants. I know, Neville said, and there was a quiet warmth in how he said it, the warmth of someone for whom that specific kind of conversation is a good thing. I'll go now. He went. Harry watched him thread through the crowded great hall with more confidence than he'd had yesterday, the particular growing confidence of someone who's been given the right kind of task, and thought that Neville Longbottom was going to be, when he found his footing, considerably more than anyone currently expected. We have defense against the dark arts this morning, Hermione said in the tone of someone reporting a mildly concerning weather forecast. Quirrell, Harry said. Who has been visibly unsettled since the feast? He was in the staff meeting yesterday, Harry said. And he knows what happened. And he is... He thought about Quirrell. The stammer that came and went. The turban that sat too high on the back of his head. The specific quality of his nervousness, which was not the nervousness of a timid man but of a man concealing something load-bearing. He's the most interesting of the staff. Interesting how? Hermione asked carefully. Interesting as in I don't know what he's concealing yet, Harry said, which means I should pay very close attention in that class and take notes on everything that doesn't fit. Defense against the dark arts smelled like garlic. Aggressively, specifically entirely garlic. The classroom was garlanded with it the way a superstitious uncle would garland a doorway. Thick braids of it hung from every beam and draped across every surface with the dedication of someone who either had an advanced fear of vampires or wanted people to think they did. Quirrell began the class with a stuttering explanation of his time in Albania, which was the kind of explanation that answered a question nobody had asked in a way that raised several more, and Harry wrote everything down. The stammer was inconsistent, it slid off certain consonants and was absent entirely from others, which suggested it was managed rather than natural. The turban sat wrong. Not crooked, not tilted, just wrong in a structural sense, too padded at the back, as though the space it occupied was being used for something. Harry was thinking about this when Quirrell's eyes moved to him in the middle of a sentence about the Transylvanian vampire wars and stayed there for exactly a second too long. Harry met the look steadily. Quirrell looked away. "He's afraid of you," Hermione whispered from beside him. "He's afraid of something specific," Harry said quietly. "Whether it's me or the situation or—" He stopped. Made a note. "Something about the way he moved when I mentioned the testing vial and potions yesterday. He was 2 tables away and he made a sound." Hermione hadn't heard it. She looked at him. "I'll explain later," Harry said, because Quirrell had turned back toward the class. The lesson was mediocre. Coverage of basic dark creature taxonomy that Harry had read in Fantastic Beasts 2 weeks ago, but the edges of it were more interesting than the center. Quirrell made 2 specific errors in his coverage of werewolf identification, both of which were errors in the direction of obscuring the creature's vulnerabilities rather than explaining them, which could be carelessness or could be something else. Harry wrote down both errors, dated and time-stamped. When the class ended and the students filed out into the corridor's stone chill, Harry hung back, and Quirrell, gathering parchment at his desk, became aware that he was still there in the specific way that people become aware of presences that make them nervous. The slight stiffening of the shoulders, the too casual turn. "Mr. Potter," Quirrell said. "Was there something? I noticed the garlic," Harry said pleasantly. "Ah," Quirrell said. "Yes. A precautionary. How long have you been back from Albania?" Harry said. Quirrell paused in his gathering. "I returned in the spring. I spent a year travel. The Vampire Wars reference was out of date," Harry said. "The academic consensus shifted in 1987. The text you're using predates that." He picked up his bag. "You'd know that if you'd been doing recent research. But maybe you weren't researching vampires while you were in Albania." He looked at Quirrell with the same clear, direct attention he'd given Dumbledore in the Great Hall. "I notice things that don't fit, Professor. I'm telling you that because I think you should know." Quirrell looked at him. The stammer was entirely absent. His face had gone very still. "I think," he said quietly, without any performance in it, "that you are a very dangerous boy, Mr. Potter." "I'm an 11-year-old with a library card," Harry said. "The danger is mostly in what I do with what I read." He adjusted his bag strap. "I'll see you next lesson, Professor." He walked out into the corridor, where Hermione was waiting with her arms crossed. "You poked him," she said. "I let him know I'm watching," Harry said. "There's a difference." "He said you were dangerous." "He's probably right," Harry said, without any particular concern about it, and they went to their next class. History of Magic was taught by Professor Binns, who was dead. Not metaphorically dead in the way that bad teachers often seem to be, actually dead, a genuine ghost who had reportedly died at his desk one day and simply got up and continued teaching without acknowledging the interruption. He drifted through his notes with a voice like a slow drain and an organizational principle that suggested he experienced time differently than the living, and Harry had to actively work to find the interesting things in what he was saying, which he did by treating Binns's lecture the way he treated old documents, looking for the anomalies rather than the structure. He found 3 in the first 20 minutes. The first was a reference to the Hogwarts Building Acts of 1783, which Binns mentioned in passing as context for a larger discussion of goblin rebellions and then moved past without stopping, but which Harry noted because the Building Acts governed what could be installed in the castle and by whose authority, and might have something to say about the portrait network's reporting structure. The second was an oblique reference to the historical record integrity provisions, which Binns mentioned in the context of the 1600s and then characterized as largely archaic, which was the kind of dismissal that usually meant exactly the opposite. The third was something Binns didn't say. He reached a section of his notes about Hogwarts administrative history in the early 1900s, and his voice, which had been in a continuous monotone for the previous 30 minutes, went slightly flatter, and he moved through that section at approximately twice his usual pace. Harry wrote, he skipped something. What happened in Hogwarts administration early 1900s? Records room. After class, as the others escaped into the corridor with the velocity of people exiting a long tunnel, Harry waited. Professor Binns, he said. Binns drifted toward the door without fully registering that he'd been addressed. Professor Binns, Harry said slightly louder. Binns stopped. Turned slowly, the turn of a ghost who has been in the middle of the same sequence of thoughts for decades and is mildly surprised by interruption. He looked at Harry with the unfocused gaze of someone for whom the present is slightly less real than the past. Ah, Binns said. Yes. Student. Harry Potter. Yes, Binns said, with no particular reaction to the name. You had a question about the Battle of Binches? No, Harry said. I had a question about the historical record integrity provisions. Specifically about what they prevent. Binns blinked slowly. The lights behind his ghostly eyes did something, not quite sharpening, but changing. Like a man whose long habit of boredom has been surprised by something. The provisions, Binns said, and his voice had lost a shade of its monotone, not gaining life exactly but gaining texture. The historical record integrity provisions of 1612, governing amendment, alteration, or removal of any official institutional record by any party including administrative, educational, or governmental authority, without formal committee process and three-party witness. Harry's pen was already moving. If someone were to alter records at Hogwarts, Harry said carefully, the provisions would require, any alteration must be filed with a separate witness log. Binns said. The witness log is itself unalterable. The location of the primary witness logs is the secondary archive, accessible only to the archivist, the Board of Governors, and the Historical Record Committee, which is... He stopped. Drifted. Then came back. Which has not met since 1972. The archivist's position has been vacant since 1981. Since 1981, Harry said. The year my parents, yes, Binns said, and for just one moment his ghost eyes were very clear. I recall noting the coincidence at the time. He drifted back toward the door. The secondary archive is behind the primary archive in the records room. There is a locked door. The key is a specific spell, derived from the school's foundational enchantment. He paused. It responds to legitimate need, he said, as though reading from somewhere deep in his institutional memory. And to direct request, and to the magical signature of a documented Hogwarts student in good standing. He looked at Harry. I believe those are your circumstances. He drifted through the wall. Harry stood in the empty classroom and wrote down every word for 30 seconds. Then he went to find the others. They went to the records room during lunch. Fred and George had provided a route that bypassed the main corridors and the three portraits Harry had identified as active reporters, moving through a series of lower passages that smelled of old stone and cold water, and had ceilings low enough that Fred had to duck. Neville came with them, having returned from the greenhouse with a notebook full of Sprout's Harvest records, which he presented to Harry with a quiet satisfaction that made him look, for a moment, like a completely different person than the one who had apologized for nearly everything on the first day of term. Bitterroot, Neville said. Unusual requisition in August. A week before term started. The quantity was, here, he pointed. 3 times the normal cultivation yield. All going to the main kitchen supply. Sprout noted it in her records because she thought it was a mistake, but the authorization signature was. He pointed. Harry read the signature. Dumbledore, Harry said, not as a surprise but as a confirmation. He signed the kitchen supply authorization personally. In August. 3 times the normal yield of Bitterroot. He looked at Neville. That's excellent work. Neville ducked his head briefly, and Harry made a note to himself to be more explicit about this kind of thing with Neville specifically, because Neville had been told by enough people that he wasn't capable that the contrary evidence needed to be clear and unambiguous. That's excellent work, Neville, Harry said again, more directly. I mean it. This is the physical supply chain evidence. Without this, we had the compounds in the food and Dumbledore's signature on the placement documents. With this, we have a preparation timeline that predates the school year. He was planning this before I ever arrived. Neville held the notebook a little differently. The secondary archive was behind the locked door Binns had described, and the door did respond, not dramatically, not with a flash of light or a spoken password, but with a quiet, considered click when Harry pressed his palm flat against it and said, in a voice that was simply direct and not performative, "I am a student of Hogwarts and I need to know what happened here." The door opened. The secondary archive was smaller than the primary records room, lower ceilinged, and organized on a different principle, not by year or subject but by event, each section labeled with a date, and a brief description in the same spidery handwriting that appeared throughout the oldest Hogwarts documents. Harry moved along the shelves quickly, reading labels. 1981, he said. He found the section. It ran across 2 entire shelves, which was unusual given that event-based sections in the archive ranged from a single file to perhaps a dozen. He pulled the first file. And stopped. "What is it?" Hermione said from behind his shoulder. Harry held up the file so she could read the header. Hogwarts Administrative Reorganization, Emergency Authority Transfer, October/November 1981, filed under Historical Record Integrity Provisions as Archivist Record, pre-vacancy. The last thing the archivist filed before the position went vacant. Harry said. He opened it. The contents were dense, administrative language layered over institutional procedure over specific dates, but Harry read it with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything, and what it said, stripped to its fundamentals, was this: in the days immediately following the deaths of James and Lily Potter, Dumbledore had invoked an emergency authority measure, a provision that had last been used during the First World War. Designed for genuine existential crises, and used it to expand the Headmaster's authority over school administration into territory that had previously required board approval. The archivist at the time, a wizard named Cornelius Fawn, whose name appeared in the document header, had filed this record under the integrity provisions, with the specific notation that the invocation of emergency authority had, in his professional opinion, been applied to a situation that did not meet the threshold. He had lodged a formal objection. "Where is Cornelius Fawn now?" Hermione asked. Harry checked the back of the file. There was a follow-up notation, different handwriting, dated 3 weeks after the primary document. Archivist Fawn has tendered resignation effective immediately. Position to remain vacant pending appointment process. Authority for archive access transferred to Headmaster's office pending appointment. He was pushed out, Harry said. The archivist who filed the objection was pushed out, the position was left vacant so no one could file further objections, and Dumbledore's emergency authority measure, which was meant to expire after 6 months, was never formally reviewed or revoked because the person responsible for flagging that review was gone. The room was very quiet. Fred and George, who had been leaning against the wall with the careful stillness of people who understand that the moment is bigger than their usual mode, exchanged a look. "That's," George started. "That's a 45-year-old abuse of emergency provision," Harry said. "Still technically active, still granting Dumbledore authority over school administration that no headmaster should legally have." He looked at the file. "And documented in his own archive, because the archivist was thorough enough to file it before he was forced out, and the integrity provisions made it irremovable afterward. He didn't know it was here," Hermione said. "Or he knew and didn't think anyone would find it. He didn't think anyone would think to look," Harry said. "Most people don't." He copied the document in full, carefully, using the duplicate charm McGonagall had shown him the previous night for the first set of documents. "We have 3 now. The placement documents with the monitoring charms. The kitchen supply records with the Bitterroot authorization. And this, the emergency authority measure." He looked at Hermione. "What do we still need?" "A direct connection between the loyalty potion compound and Dumbledore's specific authorization," Hermione said immediately. "The Bitterroot supply gets us the materials. The placement records get us the design intent. But we need something that says specifically that Dumbledore ordered the potion to be placed in the food." She paused. The kitchen staff. Someone prepared the food. The house elves? Harry said. Hermione made a sound. The Hogwarts kitchens are run by house elves, Harry said. They would have prepared the food following specific instructions. House elf testimony, would it be admissible in any formal process? Hermione asked. The 1842 bylaws have a section on institutional testimony, Harry said, which made Fred audibly choke from his position against the wall. It covers non-human magical entities employed by the school. Their account of instructions received is considered official institutional record. How do we access the kitchens? Neville asked. I'll ask the twins, Harry said, glancing at Fred and George. Tickle the pear, they said simultaneously. Harry blinked. I'm sorry? Portrait of a fruit bowl, 4th floor, Fred said. Tickle the pear in the portrait. Door opens. Why a pear? Neville asked. We have genuinely never asked, George said. The kitchen was underground and enormous and hot with the particular productive heat of a space that has been cooking continuously for centuries. It smelled like every meal simultaneously, bread and something roasted and the sharp clean smell of fresh herbs, and when Harry came in through the pear door, approximately 30 house elves looked up from their various tasks simultaneously, their large eyes wide and their ears at precise angles that expressed, collectively, a kind of startled attentiveness. Harry had thought about how to approach this. He had decided on direct honesty, which was what he generally decided on, but the specific texture of the honesty mattered here in a way it hadn't with Marchbanks, or the Portrait Committee, or even Dumbledore. Because the house elves of Hogwarts were in a position where their employment, their home, and their safety were all under the authority of the school, which meant that honesty in this room had to come with the explicit acknowledgement that he was asking them for something that might cost them something. My name is Harry Potter, he said to the room generally. I need to ask some questions, and I want to be clear about what they're for and what the risk of answering might be. The house elves moved slightly. A small one near the front, large eyes, threadbare pillowcase, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from very focused attention, stepped forward. Dobby is knowing who you are, the elf said. His voice was high and precise and had a specific quality of suppressed emotion in it, the way a pressurized container has a specific quality. Dobby has been hoping to speak to Harry Potter. Harry looked at him. You know why I'm here? Dobby is knowing about the food, Dobby said very quietly. Dobby is knowing what was put in the food. Dobby is knowing who gave the instructions. His ears trembled slightly. Dobby is not. He stopped. His hands moved toward his own ears in the nervous, reflexive gesture of a creature habituated to self-punishment, then stopped. Dobby is wanting to tell Harry Potter, but Dobby is afraid. You don't have to tell me anything, Harry said. I mean that. I'm not going to push, and I'm not going to be angry with you if you can't speak about it. Dobby looked at him. His eyes were very bright. If Dobby were to tell, Dobby said slowly, and if Harry Potter were to do something with what Dobby tells, if the people who need to know were to know, Dobby is thinking that perhaps this is not Dobby breaking the rules of his household. He was working through this with visible effort, constructing a logical pathway through constraints that Harry could only partially understand. If the instructions Dobby was given were themselves against the rules, against the proper rules, the old rules, the written rules, then following those instructions was the mistake, not the historical record integrity provisions, Harry said quietly. They cover institutional staff. The 1842 bylaws define house elves employed by Hogwarts as institutional staff. He looked at Dobby steadily. If you were given instructions that violate the school's foundational legal framework, following those instructions was the violation. Not telling me about them. Dobby's ears went very straight. Then he produced, from somewhere in his pillowcase, a small folded piece of parchment, which he held out to Harry with both hands in a quality of significance that made the whole kitchen go quiet. Harry took it. It was a kitchen instruction sheet, written in Dumbledore's handwriting. Harry had seen enough of it now to recognize it immediately. The header read Specific Preparation for Seat Assignment 1A, Welcome Feast September 1991. The instructions specified the addition of a prepared compound to 3 specific dishes and the pumpkin juice, with dosage amounts and timing. At the bottom, a note in smaller writing: the compound has been prepared by the Contracted Potions Authority. Add as specified. This instruction supersedes standard preparation protocol and is not to be noted in the standard kitchen record. Not to be noted in the standard kitchen record. This was given to you separately, Harry said. Outside the normal instruction process. Yes, Dobby said. Dobby was told to keep it separate and destroy it after the feast. He looked at Harry. Dobby did not destroy it. Dobby is not always doing what he is told when what he is told is wrong. Harry folded the instruction sheet very carefully and placed it inside his copy documents with the same steadiness he brought to all of this, but something moved in him at the sight of those words, not to be noted in the standard kitchen record, and at the sight of Dobby standing in front of him with his ears straight, and his hands still, and a specific quiet courage that was all the more real for how afraid he was while he was being it. Thank you, Harry said, and he said it with the same weight he'd used with McGonagall, the weight of something genuinely meant. Will Harry Potter? Dobby stopped. Started again. Will this be ending? I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it does, Harry said. He looked around at the other elves, the 30 of them still watching, still wide-eyed, some clustered near the preparation tables, some in the back near the ovens. He looked at Dobby. Are you the only one who received that instruction? Yes, Dobby said. Dobby was chosen because Dobby is very good at preparation and very, very good at keeping things to himself. A pause. Dumbledore is thinking that Dobby is keeping things to himself. He underestimated you, Harry said. Dobby's ears went even straighter. Yes, Dobby said with quiet, precise satisfaction. He did. They took dinner in the common room that evening, brought up from the kitchen by a platter the twins produced by means Harry decided not to ask about, and spread across 3 tables pushed together while the fire burned at full height, and the rain came down outside the tower windows in earnest. The group had expanded. It had done so organically, the way these things happen when a credible center forms. People orbit it before they decide to land. Hannah Abbott was there, with her library file, and Justin Finch-Fletchley, who had followed Hannah with the ease of a person who has been following Hannah for 2 years. A Ravenclaw named Terry Boot had arrived during the afternoon with a copy of the relevant Ministry statute on magical consent in minors, which he placed in front of Harry without preamble, and said only, "This was in the restricted law section. I thought you might not have found it yet." A quiet Hufflepuff named Susan Bones had identified herself as Amelia Bones's niece and offered to carry correspondence between Harry and her aunt directly, which was both practically useful and a tacit statement of family alignment. Harry looked at the people around these tables and thought about what they were and what they weren't. They weren't an army. They weren't a movement. They were a collection of 11 and 12-year-olds who had looked at a situation and decided, each for their own reasons, that it was wrong, and had come to find something to do about it. Hannah because evidence mattered. Terry because law mattered. Susan because her aunt had told her, clearly, what kind of person she should be. Neville because Harry had treated him like a person, and he was repaying the compliment. They were enough. More than enough. They were exactly what was needed. Fred and George were reviewing the archived documents with the focused attention of people who have decided to apply their considerable gifts to something real, making notes in the margin and occasionally exchanging looks that communicated entire plans in 2 seconds. "The Emergency Authority provision from 1981, Fred said. "If this is presented to Marchbanks at the board session, it invalidates the last decade of administrative decisions made under it," Harry said. "Every expansion of the Headmaster's discretionary authority that referenced this provision as precedent would need to be reviewed." He picked at his food. "That's not the goal. The goal is accountability for specific actions, not dismantling the whole institution." "But the provision being invalid," George said, "means he's been acting without proper authority for 45 years. That's something Marchbanks will use correctly," Harry said. I trust her to use it correctly. I don't want to hand it to someone who'll use it wrong. He looked at them both. Your father is Arthur Weasley, right? He works at the Ministry? Fred and George looked at each other. Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. Fred said cautiously. Does he know any people in the Administrative Law Division? Not to contact yet. Just, does he know people there? He knows everyone. George said slowly. Dad knows everyone. It's his specific talent. He finds everyone interesting and they find him, Dad. Which means they talk to him. Harry said. And trust him. He nodded. Write to him. Not about the legal stuff yet. Just tell him what happened. The short version. And ask him to keep it in mind. The twins looked at each other for a longer time than usual, a look that went through several private conversations quickly. Right, Fred said. We'll write to him tonight. Harry. Susan Bones set down her pumpkin juice and looked at him with the direct, clear-eyed quality that she seemed to have inherited from her aunt. My aunt's second letter. Did she say what she needed from you to move on the formal complaint? Evidence sufficient to establish a pattern of action rather than isolated incident, Harry said. The kitchen instruction sheet gives us a specific recorded act. The supply records give us premeditation. The archive documents give us structural context. He paused. She also said she needed, and this is the part I've been thinking about, she needed an official Hogwarts staff witness willing to provide a signed statement. The table went quiet. McGonagall, Hermione said. McGonagall, Harry confirmed. She knows about the placement documents. She knows about the monitoring charms. She wrote the original objection in 1981. He looked at his food. I need to ask her directly. Tonight. Will she do it? Hannah asked. Harry thought about McGonagall in the records room, reading the documents, making the tight sounds that weren't quite words. Making her own notes, with her own tight handwriting. Leaving the report outside the dormitory door in a plain envelope with no note. Yes, he said. I think she will. I think she's been waiting for someone to ask. Why didn't she act before? Neville asked. The question wasn't accusatory. It was the genuine curiosity of someone who has also been waiting for someone to ask. Because you can't do this alone, Harry said. You need the documents and the witnesses and the proper channels and the board connection and the ministry contact and the house elf testimony and the potion evidence and the archive records, and even if one person found one of those things, without the others it's just a complaint against the most respected man in the wizarding world. He looked around the table. You need all of it at once. And you need it fast, before any of it disappears. How fast? Terry Boot asked. The board emergency session, Harry said. Marchbanks needs the invocation. I can submit it as a student under the 1842 provisions. She can call the session within 48 hours of receiving it. He looked at the table. I want to send it by end of this week. That's 3 days, Hermione said. 3 days to have everything ready. 2, Harry said. I want a day buffer. The table processed this. Okay, Hermione said, with the voice of someone rolling up their sleeves. What does each of us need to do? Harry told them. He went through it cleanly and clearly, assigning tasks based on what each person was actually good at, and where they had access he didn't. Terry on the statutory research, filling in the legal framework around the emergency authority provision. Susan as the communication relay with her aunt, shorter loop than Oling. Hannah on the library materials, specifically the consent law history that ran back before 1842 and could provide context. Neville on Sprout, a follow-up question about the Bitterroot, whether there had been any previous unusual requisitions before this year. Fred and George got the interesting assignment. Harry wanted the portrait network mapped, specifically, which portraits had active reporting instructions and what the information flow looked like. Not to disrupt it, not yet, just to understand the topology. You want to know what Dumbledore knows that we know, Fred said. I want to know what Dumbledore knows that we don't know he knows, Harry said. There's information he's getting from the portrait network that we haven't accounted for. I want to find the gaps. Hermione got the archive work. The secondary archive still had 2 full shelves of the 1981 section they hadn't fully reviewed, and Harry wanted a comprehensive document list. And Harry would talk to McGonagall. He went at 8:30, having sent Susan ahead with a brief note asking if she was available. McGonagall's office was on the first floor, and she opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching for him. Her office was neat in the specific way of someone who has been neat for so long it has stopped being an effort. She had a fire going and 2 chairs set beside it, and she gestured to one with the brief efficiency of a woman who has decided to have a frank conversation and is not interested in staging. Harry sat. "You need a signed statement," she said. "Yes," he said. "For Amelia Bones. To accompany the formal board petition." McGonagall looked at the fire. She had a glass of something amber on the table beside her, barely touched. "I have been," she said slowly, "at this school for 37 years. I have believed in certain things about it. About the people in it." She paused. "I have made accommodations. For what I believe were good reasons. For the greater good of—" She stopped. The phrase hung in the air. "That's what he says too," Harry said quietly. "Isn't it?" McGonagall looked at him. "Yes," she said very quietly. "It is. The greater good is the oldest reason in the world for doing harm to people who are in no position to object," Harry said. "I think you know that. I think you've known it for a while." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to destroy him. I'm asking you to tell the truth." McGonagall picked up her glass. Set it down without drinking. "If I provide this statement," she said, "my position at Hogwarts is protected under the same 1842 provisions that protect me," Harry said. "Staff retaliation against a witness who provides a statement in a formal safeguarding proceeding is specifically prohibited. I found the clause this afternoon." Something moved through McGonagall's face. "Of course you did," she said, and there was something in her voice that was grief and admiration in equal parts, something that sounded like a woman who has spent 37 years in a school and is only now meeting the kind of student she should have been meeting all along. She pulled a piece of parchment from the table beside her. Harry looked at it. She had already started writing. "You knew I'd come," he said. "I knew you'd come," she confirmed. "I wrote the preamble this afternoon. I left the specific evidentiary section blank because I wanted to hear from you what specifically was needed." She picked up her quill. "Tell me what you have. Start from the beginning," Harry told her. He told her about Dobby and the kitchen instruction sheet. He told her about the emergency authority provision and Cornelius Fawn. He told her about the Bitterroot requisition and Neville's notes from Sprout's records. He told her about the portrait committee and the reporting instructions and the specific list of names. He told her about Marchbanks and the board session and what Susan Bones had relayed that afternoon from her aunt. McGonagall wrote for 45 minutes. When she finished, she read it back to herself quietly, made 2 corrections, and set the quill down. "There is one thing I want to add," she said. "That is not in your documents." "What?" "Albus told me," she said, looking at the fire, "in the autumn of 1981, that he had arranged your placement specifically. That the blood protection would anchor to the emotional environment of the house. That it required, his word, a degree of want on the part of the guardians." She paused. "I asked him what he meant by that. He said the magic was stronger the more the guardian wanted you there." She picked up the glass again, didn't drink. "Petunia Dursley did not want you there. Albus knew that. The protection was never as strong as it should have been, because the foundational condition was never met." She set the glass down. "He placed you in a home where you were not wanted, knowing the magic required you to be wanted, and justified it as protection." The fire crackled. "He was never protecting me from Voldemort," Harry said. "He was protecting the plan," McGonagall said. "He was protecting the specific psychological outcome he required." She pushed the statement across the desk to Harry. I will witness this and sign it tonight. Susan Bones can take it to her aunt tomorrow morning. Harry took it. Read every word. Folded it. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, McGonagall said, with the tight jaw. I should have done this 10 years ago. You couldn't have done it 10 years ago, Harry said, which was true. You couldn't have done it 5 years ago, or last year. You can do it now. He stood up. Moved to the door. Paused. Professor, he said. What was my mother like? McGonagall looked at him. For a moment her face did something complicated and private and genuine, the expression of a woman accessing something she has protected carefully for a long time. She was, McGonagall said slowly, the most perceptive student I have taught in 37 years. She looked at Harry. Until last Tuesday. Harry nodded once. He went back through the castle's night corridors, past the torchlit portraits who watched him pass with their painted eyes, along the routes the twins had mapped, up through the tower to the warm noise of the common room, where the others were still working around the pushed-together tables, and he set McGonagall's statement with the other documents, and looked at the stack of evidence and felt, for the first time since the vial had gone dark green, something that was not the cold-focused satisfaction of necessary work but something warmer, the feeling of not being alone, which was new enough that he needed a moment to identify it correctly. Neville looked up from his notes. How did it go? Good, Harry said, which was the most honest single word he had. He sat down, picked up the next piece of work, and the fire burned high, and the rain came down outside, and somewhere in the castle the portraits carried their quiet freight of information through painted corridors that knew everything, and Harry Potter, who was 11 years old and had been told his whole life that he was nothing, sat in the warm light and built the case that was going to change everything, one true thing at a time. Chapter 4: The Sorted and the Unsorted. The board petition went out on Thursday morning. Harry had written the invocation himself, using the exact language from the 1842 student safeguarding provisions, which he'd copied out 3 times until the phrasing was so embedded in his thinking that it came out cleanly on the 4th attempt. Susan Bones carried it to her aunt by hand rather than owl, a 3-hour round trip on a school day that she undertook without complaint, having gotten McGonagall's permission under the cover of a family emergency, which was not entirely untrue. The petition cited 6 grounds. The loyalty potion administration, documented by the kitchen instruction sheet in Dumbledore's own handwriting. The unauthorized monitoring charm network, documented by the portrait committee's records. The emergency authority provision of 1981, documented by Cornelius Fawn's archived objection. The personal placement decision and its documented intent, from the monitoring records. The Bitterroot supply chain, from Sprout's harvest logs. And McGonagall's signed statement, which was the 6th ground and in many ways the most important, because it was the one that turned a student's accusation into an institutional admission. Marchbanks responded by noon. Emergency session called. 48 hours. Saturday, 10 o'clock. Location: the board chambers at the ministry. You will be expected to attend and present. I have the signatures. Do not be late. GM Harry read it, folded it, and went to Transfiguration. He did not tell Dumbledore. He was aware that the silence was itself a kind of communication, that Dumbledore would notice the absence of any attempt at dialogue, would read the stillness the way generals read quiet before an offensive, would know that something was in motion that he hadn't been invited to watch. This was deliberate. Harry was not interested in giving Dumbledore time to prepare a counterposition, and the 48-hour window was narrow enough that, managed correctly, it would expire before Dumbledore had a full picture of what had been assembled. What Harry had not fully accounted for was that Dumbledore was also assembling something. He found this out through the portraits. Fred and George had mapped the active reporting network thoroughly by Thursday afternoon, and their map revealed 3 things of interest. First, the portraits near the headmaster's office had been transmitting at higher than usual frequency since Tuesday morning, which meant Dumbledore was receiving more information than normal, and was processing it actively. Second, the specific portrait in the corridor outside McGonagall's office, a painting of a shepherd and some sheep that Harry had walked past a dozen times without considering, had a direct line in its reporting instructions to the headmaster's private study rather than the general office, which was a specific distinction that implied the information it carried was being handled differently. Third, and most interesting, 2 of the 11 students on the active monitoring list had been in close proximity to Harry for extended periods this week, which meant Dumbledore had been receiving detailed observation of Harry's movements and associations. "He knows who's helping you," Fred said, spreading the map across the common room table. "He knows who," Harry said, looking at the network. "He may not know what." He traced the reporting lines with his finger. "The portrait network gives him location and general interaction quality. It doesn't give him document content." He tapped the shepherd portrait. "This one is specific to McGonagall's corridor. He knows she met with me last night. He knows about the statement," Hermione said. "He knows we spoke for 45 minutes, Harry said. "He can infer a statement. He can't read what it says." He sat back. "What would he do with that information?" "Try to talk to McGonagall before the board session," Neville said from across the table. The certainty in his voice was new, or not new, but newly surfaced, the kind of certainty that had always been there under the uncertainty, and was finally being used. "Convince her it's not necessary. Or that it's misguided. He'll use the long relationship." 37 years, Harry said. "Yes." He looked at Hermione. "She needs to know he's going to come to her." "She already knows," Hermione said. "She's been at this school longer than any of us. She knows how he operates." "Knowing and being prepared are different things," Harry said. He stood up. "I'm going to talk to her again." He was halfway to the portrait hole when the hole swung open and Draco Malfoy came through it for the second time in 3 days, which generated a different kind of reaction from the common room than his first visit, less outrage, more resigned attention, the reaction of people who have decided to update their expectations. Draco looked at Harry and said, without preamble, "My father knows about the board session." Harry stopped. "How?" He called in a favor from someone in Marchbanks's outer office. Draco's face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing between the constructed and the real. "He's coming Saturday. He's planning to use the session to present his own motion regarding Dumbledore's fitness for office. He wants to be the one who removes him." "I see," Harry said. "He thinks you've done the work and he's going to walk in and take the result," Draco said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite contempt but was adjacent to it, and Harry noted that the contempt was directed at his father and not at Harry, which was information. "What do you want me to do with this?" Harry asked. Draco was quiet for a moment. He looked around the common room, at Fred and George with their map, at Hermione with her files, at Neville with his notes, at Hannah and Terry who had come up after dinner and were reviewing the statutory materials, and his expression moved through something Harry couldn't fully read. "My father is going to arrive with his own documentation," Draco said. "He has been building a case against Dumbledore for years. Some of it is legitimate grievance. Some of it is self-interest dressed as legitimate grievance. He'll present it in a way that makes him look like the principled party." He looked at Harry. "If the board accepts his framing, you get the outcome you wanted, Dumbledore removed, but on terms that replace Dumbledore's influence with my father's." "Which is why you're telling me," Harry said. "I'm telling you," Draco said carefully, "because I think you're the only person in this room who can make sure that doesn't happen. And because—" He stopped. The complicated expression was at its most visible. "And because I would prefer it not to happen." Harry looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what Draco had said about the Sorting Hat. About what it took to come to a Gryffindor common room twice without being asked, without an alliance offer, without the safety of a transactional framing. He thought about what it meant to give someone information that you couldn't take back, about people whose upbringing had shaped them toward a specific loyalty, and who were standing in the gap between the shaping and the choice. "I'm going to need Marchbanks to understand the distinction," Harry said. Between Dumbledore's specific actions, which are documented and prosecutable, and a general motion of no confidence, which is political and can be captured. He looked at Draco. Can you get me the documentation your father's bringing? Not to use. Just to know what's in it. Draco's jaw tightened. That would be, I'm not asking you to steal it, Harry said. I'm asking if you know what's in it. You live with a man. He prepares. Draco was quiet. He has testimony from 3 former students, Draco said at last slowly. He has correspondence that he says proves Dumbledore influenced the Wizengamot sentencing in 1981 to ensure certain people went to Azkaban without trial. He paused. He has a private report from a healer at St. Mungo's about Dumbledore's meeting with certain individuals after Voldemort's defeat. Harry filed every word. Thank you, he said. Draco nodded once, the nod of someone who has committed to something and is done second-guessing it. He turned to go. Draco, Harry said. Draco turned back. The Sorting Hat, Harry said. What did it say to you? Draco's expression did the complicated thing one more time. It said I had a great capacity for loyalty. He paused. And that I hadn't yet discovered what was actually worth being loyal to. He climbed through the portrait hole. The common room was quiet for a moment. Do you trust him? Hermione asked. Harry thought about it honestly. I trust that he's telling the truth about what he told me, he said. I trust that he has his own reasons and they're not simply his father's reasons. I don't know him well enough yet for the rest. He picked up his bag. McGonagall. And then we rework Saturday's presentation for the board to address the Lucius Malfoy problem. He went. McGonagall was in her office, which Harry had half expected, with the expression of someone who has been sitting with a difficult thing and has been sitting with it long enough that they've moved through several different ways of holding it. She looked up when Harry knocked. He came, she said. Dumbledore. An hour ago. She gestured at the chair beside the fire. Harry sat. He was Albus. That's the only way I can describe it. He was completely himself. The warmth, the long-view wisdom, the specific way he has of making you feel that the larger perspective is always exactly the perspective that excuses the thing you're uncomfortable about. She looked at the fire. He told me that your petition to the board, while understandable given your understandable distress, would cause consequences that extended far beyond Hogwarts. That there were plans in motion, necessary plans, that required a degree of operational security that you were, through no fault of your own, threatening to unravel. She paused. He used the phrase operational security. About an 11-year-old boy. He told you about Voldemort, Harry said. McGonagall looked at him. He told you the plan involves me confronting Voldemort at some point, Harry said. That the loyalty potions and the psychological preparation were necessary for, what? Making sure I don't run? Making sure I'm attached enough to this world to sacrifice myself for it if it comes to that? The fire popped. He didn't say sacrifice, McGonagall said quietly. He didn't say it, Harry said. She didn't respond to that. The silence said enough. There is something going on at this school right now, Harry said, because this was the moment to be specific. Something beyond the historical. Something current. Quirrell. The 3rd-floor corridor. I don't know the details yet, but I know the shape of it. He looked at McGonagall. Whatever Dumbledore is protecting, it's here. And whatever's supposed to happen with it, I think he needs me emotionally committed and personally loyal enough that when it happens, I respond the way he needs me to respond. McGonagall's expression had gone very still. The 3rd-floor corridor is strictly off-limits, she said, and it came out sounding less like a warning and more like a woman repeating something she has been told to believe. I know, Harry said. I'm not going to go anywhere near it. I don't need to. I just need to understand the structural purpose I'm supposed to serve. He met her eyes. He told you to withdraw the statement. He asked me to reconsider, she said. He made it. She stopped. He made it sound like protecting you and protecting his plans were the same thing. Are they? McGonagall was silent for a long time. I don't think, she said at last, very carefully, that they have ever been the same thing. I think he has always genuinely believed that they were. But believing something with absolute conviction doesn't make it true, Harry said. True, she confirmed. Are you withdrawing the statement? She looked at him. 45 seconds of looking, during which the fire moved through several shades of orange, and the shadows in the room shifted slightly. No, she said. Harry let out a breath he hadn't been tracking. But Harry, she said, and her voice changed, dropped the formality and the precision and became something more personal, something that cost her something. I need you to understand what you're walking into on Saturday. Albus is, the Wiesengemot defers to him. The ministry respects him. He defeated Grindelwald. He is the reason that half the families in Britain still have homes and not ashes. She leaned forward slightly. Even with everything you have, even with Amelia Bones and Griselda Marchbanks and the documentation, he will stand up in that room and he will be Albus Dumbledore, and some of those board members will look at you and see a very clever 11-year-old boy, and look at him and see the savior of the wizarding world. I know, Harry said. And you're not afraid. I'm appropriately concerned, Harry said, which made something happen in McGonagall's face that was close to a laugh. The documentation is stronger than the reputation. It has to be. That's the only way to beat someone whose primary asset is being believed. What do you need from me for Saturday? Your presence, Harry said. Sit in the gallery. You don't have to speak unless you're asked. But I need him to see you there. He paused. And I need you to answer honestly if Marchbanks asks you directly whether you believe the monitoring charm reports were falsified before I could access them. McGonagall frowned. Were they? I don't know, Harry said. Which is why I need you to answer honestly. If they were, your answer establishes that. If they weren't, your answer establishes that. Either way, the truth does the work. He stood up. Have you eaten dinner? The question seemed to catch her off guard. I know. I was going to. You should eat dinner, Harry said. Saturday will be long. McGonagall looked at him in the complicated way. You're 11, she said. I know, Harry said. Good night, Professor. Friday was the day everything else happened. He was in the library at 7:30, working through the remaining secondary archive list that Hermione had compiled, when Neville appeared at his table with a specific look that Harry had learned meant he had found something he hadn't been looking for. Sprout, Neville said, sitting down. She asked me to come back this morning. She said she'd been thinking about what I'd asked about the bitterroot. He set his notebook on the table. Harry, there were requisitions in 1989 and 1990 as well. Smaller quantities. She noted them as unusual but attributed them to new curriculum additions. She didn't look at them together until I asked. Harry looked at the notebook. He was preparing the compound for 2 years before I arrived. Testing it, maybe, Hermione said from across the table, where she'd been pretending to do history of magic homework. Calibrating the dosage. 3 years of preparation means the 1991 version was refined. It wasn't experimental. He knew exactly what he was doing, Harry said. Not with anger. With the settled weight of confirmed certainty. This goes in with the supply chain evidence. Neville, can Sprout provide this officially? She already wrote it up, Neville said, and produced a sealed note in Sprout's handwriting, addressed to Griselda Marchbanks, Board of Governors, which he had apparently been carrying in his pocket for the last 20 minutes. She said she'd been wanting to flag the irregular requisitions for a while and was glad someone finally asked the right question. Harry took the note. Added it to the file. He looked at Neville across the library table. Neville was sitting differently than he had on Tuesday. Not dramatically. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't the kind of change that announced itself. It was more like a shift in center of gravity, the kind of change that happens when someone stops apologizing for the space they take up. He was holding his notebook with both hands and his chin was level, and he was looking at Harry with eyes that were clear and direct. "Your Gran," Harry said. "She knows you're at Hogwarts." "Does she know what's been happening this week?" Neville looked at the table briefly. "I wrote to her Tuesday night. She's not. She has strong opinions about Dumbledore." He paused. "She has strong opinions about a lot of things. She's not easy to. She doesn't think I'm." He stopped. "She doesn't think you're capable," Harry said without inflection. "She wants me to be my dad," Neville said simply. "I'm not my dad." "What are you?" Harry asked. Neville thought about it. It wasn't an easy question, and he took it seriously. "I'm someone who notices plants," he said. "And who pays attention to things sideways. Not directly. I notice what's wrong from the side, not from the front." He looked at Harry. "Like Bitterroot. If I'd been looking for evidence of wrongdoing, I wouldn't have found it. But I was looking at harvest patterns and it was just wrong. The numbers were wrong." "That's useful," Harry said. "That specific thing. It's a different way of seeing, and it found something the direct approach would have missed." He meant it, and he said it directly. "I need more of that. You finding things sideways?" Neville nodded. The center of gravity things shifted a fraction more. The library's morning quiet was interrupted by Terry Boot appearing from behind a shelf of Wizarding Law volumes with the expression of someone who has been in the law section for 3 hours and has developed opinions. "The emergency authority provision," he said, sitting down and spreading parchment. "I found the original legislation. 1899. It was written for a specific scenario, a headmaster being incapacitated during active dark wizard threat, allowing temporary expanded authority to manage the school through the crisis." He pointed. "The critical clause is here. The provision expires, automatically by its own terms, 90 days after the initiating crisis has been resolved. Voldemort's defeat was declared by the Ministry on November 4, 1981. He looked at Harry. 90 days from November 4, 1981. February 2, 1982. Hermione said, doing the arithmetic before Harry could. "The provision should have expired," Terry said, "on February 2, 1982. It didn't, because the archivist was pushed out before he could flag the expiry, and no one else was looking." He paused. "Dumbledore has been operating under a provision that expired 44 years ago." The table was quiet. "Every single administrative decision he's made under that authority," Harry said, "is operating under a provision that expired in 1982. He looked at Terry. "Is that in the legislation clearly? Is the 90-day clause unambiguous?" "Completely unambiguous," Terry said. "I've read it 6 times. The language is precise." He pushed the parchment toward Harry. "This is the part Marchbanks is going to care about most." Harry picked up the parchment. "Read it. Set it down with the rest." He looked at the file of documents, the stack of them, all the pieces they'd assembled in 4 days, and thought about what they had. Kitchen instruction sheet in Dumbledore's hand. Supply chain records, 3 years of them. Portrait committee records. Monitoring charm documentation. McGonagall's statement. Marchbanks's prior attempts. The emergency authority provision and its expiry. The 1842 student safeguarding provisions. The portrait's testimony about reporting instructions. The integrity provisions record with Fawn's objection. Sprout's note. Terry's legal analysis. It was, Harry thought, quite a lot for 4 days. It was enough. He thought about what McGonagall had said, that Dumbledore would stand up and be Albus Dumbledore, and some people would see a very clever 11-year-old boy and the savior of the wizarding world. She was right. That was going to happen. Harry couldn't prevent it, and didn't intend to. What he could do was make the documentation so thorough, so precise, so cross-referenced and mutually corroborating that dismissing any one piece of it meant dismissing all the others, and the whole thing stood on the foundational, irrefutable fact of a kitchen instruction sheet written in Dumbledore's own hand that said not to be noted in the standard kitchen record. That was the anchor. Everything else radiated from that. He was still thinking about this when the library door opened with the specific confidence of someone who knows they're allowed to be there, and has opinions about the fact that you also are. Draco Malfoy walked to the table, looked at the assembled group, Harry, Hermione, Neville, Terry, and sat down in the empty chair at the end with the air of someone who has made a decision and is done revising it. "My father arrives in London tonight," he said. "He'll be at the Ministry by 9 Saturday morning." "Does he know you're here?" Harry asked. "No." The single word was a door closing firmly on a larger subject. "What does he plan to do with the testimony from the 3 former students?" Harry asked. Draco's jaw tightened slightly. 2 of them were students whose families were investigated after Voldemort's defeat on suspicion of association. They weren't charged, but the investigations were influenced by the Headmaster's office. "My father has their signed statements that Dumbledore's people pressured witnesses in those cases." "That's legitimate grievance," Harry said. "Yes. The Wisengamot sentencing in 1981. Harry said. "People sent to Azkaban without trial. Does he have the names?" "He has 3 names," Draco said. "One of them is Sirius Black." Something happened in Harry's chest at that name. He'd found it in the documents, his father's best friend, mentioned in the placement records as a potential guardian who had been assessed and rejected. He'd filed the name and not gone back to it yet because there was too much else to do, but it had been sitting in the back of his mind with the weight of an unanswered question. "Sirius Black is in Azkaban," Harry said. "He's supposed to have, he was never tried," Draco said. "None of the 3 were. They were convicted by emergency ministry order in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, without evidence review. My father has a ministry memo, he won't say where he got it, establishing that Dumbledore was consulted on the sentencing." He paused. "I don't think my father cares about Sirius Black. I think he cares about what using that case does to Dumbledore's credibility. But the case itself is separate from everything else," Harry said, "and enormously important on its own terms, and I cannot let your father use it as a political tool without addressing it properly." He looked at Draco. "Thank you. This is useful." Draco nodded. "Are you coming Saturday?" Harry asked. Draco looked at the table. "My father is coming. I'm not, he doesn't know I've been." He stopped. The complicated expression was back. "I don't have a reason to be there independently." "You're a student," Harry said. "The petition was filed under student safeguarding provisions. Every Hogwarts student has standing to attend." He looked at Draco steadily. "It might matter that you're there independently of your father. It might matter that the board sees you there without him." The complicated expression shifted into something more settled. "I'll be there," Draco said. Friday afternoon's defense lesson was different from the first one. Quirrell was twitchy. That was the precise word for it, not the low-level nervousness of the previous lesson but something more acute, the specific twitchiness of someone who has received information that has raised the ambient threat level. He made 2 errors in his attendance register, calling Hermione Granger-Grimes and Neville Longford, and had to be corrected both times, which he accepted with a distracted grace that suggested he wasn't fully in the room. Harry watched him all lesson. The stammer was entirely absent today, which Harry had noticed was the pattern when Quirrell was distracted. Whatever mental effort normally maintained the stammer went elsewhere when he was thinking hard about something else. The back of his turban was damp. The classroom's heavy garlic smell, which had been a constant since Monday, was slightly thinner, which could mean some of the braids had been moved or could mean something had changed in whatever was underneath the garlic's purpose. After class, Harry didn't stay. He had a different move to make. He went to find Snape. Snape's office was in the dungeon, naturally, past the potions classroom and through a door that had no nameplate but which had been described to Harry by Fred as the door that feels wrong, a description Harry had initially found unhelpfully vague until he got to it, and understood immediately what Fred meant. It felt wrong in the way that spaces feel wrong when they're inhabited by people who want them to feel unwelcoming. A deliberate quality of wrongness. Harry knocked. "Enter," Snape said, and Harry entered. The office was interesting. Every surface had something on it: jars of ingredients, reference text stacked in configurations that were organized on a principle Harry couldn't immediately parse but which clearly had one, correspondence filed in tight rolls, a single large window that looked out onto nothing but dark stone because it was underground. Snape was at his desk, marking with red ink, and he did not look up when Harry came in, which Harry identified as performance. Harry sat in the chair across from the desk. Snape went on marking. Harry waited. 45 seconds later, Snape set down his quill and looked at Harry with eyes that were flat and sharp simultaneously, a combination that took effort. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Professor Snape," Harry said. "I need to talk to you about Saturday." "I am not aware," Snape said, "of any Saturday obligation, the board session," Harry said. "Marchbanks, 10 o'clock, Ministry Chambers. You know about it." Snape's expression didn't move. "I know you know," Harry said, "because Dumbledore told the staff on Thursday morning, based on the portrait network reporting that the petition had gone out. The shepherd portrait outside McGonagall's office reported my movements. She told Dumbledore about our meeting, and he briefed the staff." He paused. "I'm not here about that. I'm here because I want to know what you're going to do." "An interesting question," Snape said with the flat, precise delivery he brought to everything. "What I do is not generally considered to be your concern. In this specific instance it is," Harry said, "because you're the person in this situation whose position I understand least, and I don't like acting with insufficient information." Snape looked at him. "You told Dumbledore to answer my question," Harry said. "In the Great Hall, in front of everyone, you cut across his deflection and told him to give a direct answer. That was not," he chose his words carefully, "that was not the action of someone who wants me to go away quietly. It was also not the action of someone straightforwardly on my side. I don't think you like me." "An accurate assessment," Snape said, without any particular heat in it. "But you told him to answer," Harry said. "Why?" Snape looked at him for a long time. The kind of long time that was not hesitation but evaluation, a man deciding how much of what was true was useful to say. "I told him to answer," Snape said at last, "because in 20 years of knowing Albus Dumbledore, I have watched him do a great many things in the name of the greater good, and I have agreed with some of them, and disagreed with others, and been complicit in a number he should not have asked me to be complicit in." The flat delivery gave no opening for inference, but the content was as direct as anything Harry had heard all week. "What he did to your food was not protection. It was engineering. There is a difference." He paused. "I have spent my career managing the consequences of that distinction. I chose not to extend the pattern." "You told him to answer because you're tired," Harry said. Snape's jaw tightened fractionally. "I told him to answer," Snape said, "because the boy asking the question deserved a straight answer. Whatever I think of the boy in question." He picked up his quill. "Is there something specific you want, Potter, or did you come here to psychoanalyze me?" "I want to know if you're going to be at the board session," Harry said. "I was not invited." "You have standing," Harry said. "Hogwarts potions professor. Institutional staff with relevant expertise in the specific compounds in question." He paused. Marchbanks would accept a staff expertise statement, specifically regarding whether the compound in my food was possible to prepare without institutional authorization and resource access. Snape set down the quill again. "You want me to testify," he said, "that the compound could not have been prepared without access to the Hogwarts potion stores and laboratory. Could it have been?" Harry asked. "No," Snape said, with the simple authority of expertise. "The specific variant you described, calibrated to an individual magical signature, compounded over 39 sequential doses, requires both the base ingredients and the precise calibration tools that exist in this school's laboratory. It is not a field preparation. It could not have been done outside this building by someone without years of access to this specific laboratory. He paused. And I would know if the laboratory had been used without my authorization, because I maintain detailed usage records. So either someone had your authorization, Harry said, or they used the laboratory without it. Or, Snape said, with the careful precision of a man who is about to say something he has clearly been thinking about. The compound was prepared before I became potions professor. He looked at Harry. I took this position in 1981. The archivist was removed in 1981. The emergency authority provision was invoked in 1981. He let that sit. I suggest you think carefully about the timeline. The compound was prepared before 1981, Harry said. While Dumbledore had direct access to the potions laboratory without a separate head of department. He thought about this. But the 1989 and 1990 requisitions were for fresh bitterroot, Snape said. Bitterroot in a prepared compound degrades over approximately 8 years. It would need to be refreshed. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was still flat, and still had the quality of active dislike but had, running underneath it, the specific quality of someone who has decided to help despite the dislike and is going to do it efficiently. The initial preparation predates my tenure. The maintenance was done under my watch, using my resources, and I was not informed. His voice, which had been a controlled instrument all week, developed a single edge on that last sentence. He used your laboratory without telling you, Harry said. He used my laboratory, Snape said, without telling me, which is itself a violation of staff authority provisions that I am now, thanks to this conversation, aware I have standing to address. He paused. I will be at the board session, Potter. Not because you invited me. Because I have my own reason. That's fine, Harry said. Your reasons are your own. He stood up. Is there anything else you can tell me about the compound that would be useful for Saturday? Snape looked at him. The dosage, Snape said. 39 sequential doses administered simultaneously. That is not efficient potion design. It is excessive. A skilled potions practitioner preparing a loyalty compound for practical use would not prepare it that way. He paused. 39 doses simultaneously is the design of someone who has one chance to administer it and wants the maximum possible impact in a single event. He met Harry's eyes. It was designed to be irreversible. Not a gradual conditioning. An attempt at permanent baseline alteration. The office was very quiet. He was trying to make it permanent, Harry said. The compound would not have been permanent, Snape said, with the precision of someone who knows the difference between the intent and the chemistry. The human mind resists loyalty compounds above a certain threshold. The compound would have degraded. But the psychological conditioning it was designed to facilitate, the specific emotional attachment it was meant to create while active, that would have had lasting influence even after the chemical component faded. He looked at Harry. You read the potions index on the train. Yes. Did you read the psychological dependency studies in Chapter 9? I read everything, Harry said. Then you understand what I'm telling you, Snape said. He wasn't just trying to make me loyal, Harry said. He was trying to make me need him. The chemical attachment was the scaffolding for the psychological one. Remove the chemical and the psychological was meant to stand on its own. Yes, Snape said. Harry nodded. He went to the door. Potter, Snape said. Harry turned back. Snape was looking at him with the expression that Harry had been trying to classify since the first potions lesson, and now, with everything else he knew, he thought he might have it. It was the expression of a man who had been living with a very specific form of guilt for a very specific period of time, and who was looking at the 11-year-old boy across his office and seeing, in that boy, evidence of everything the guilt was about. Your mother, Snape said, was exceptionally intelligent. He paused. The way she thought was precise. She noticed things. She asked the correct question before anyone else identified that a question existed. He was looking at Harry very carefully. She would have been pleased. The words landed somewhere deep and stayed there. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything this week. He went out into the dungeon corridor, and the door closed behind him with that same quality of wrongness, which felt less wrong now, and he stood in the cold for a moment, and just breathed. Then he went upstairs, because there was still work to do. Friday evening had a different atmosphere to the rest of the week. The preparation was done. Everything that could be assembled was assembled. The documents were organized, copied, filed. The statements were signed. The legal analysis was written. The contacts were in place. There was nothing left to add except time, and time was the one thing Harry had always been good at managing. He sat by the common room fire with Hermione and Neville after the others had drifted off, and for the first time all week, nobody was working. Neville was looking at the fire with a thoughtful expression that had none of the habitual apology in it. "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "What?" Harry said. "The portrait committee," Neville said. "Barnabas the Boring. He's been trying to get someone to use proper channels for 40 years. He paused. 40 years of saying the right thing and nobody listening. He looked at Harry. "What does that feel like?" Harry thought about 10 years in a cupboard under the stairs. "Familiar," he said. Neville nodded. "I think a lot of people feel like that," Hermione said quietly. "Like they've been saying something true and nobody's treating it as true." She was looking at the fire too, her arms around her knees. "I read the right books and know the right answers and people look at me like I'm too much. Too eager. Too precise." She paused. "It's a different kind of not being heard. But it's the same shape." Harry looked at her. Then at Neville. Then at the fire. "After Saturday," he said, "things are going to change. Not everything. Not all at once. But the structure that's been sitting on top of everyone in this situation, that changes." He looked at his hands. "I don't know what Dumbledore does next. I don't know what the Ministry does with the information. I don't know what happens to Quirrell and the third-floor corridor, and whatever that is." He paused. "There's a lot I don't know. But you're not worried," Neville said in the tone of someone genuinely curious about how that works. "I'm concerned about the specific things that are possible to be concerned about," Harry said. Lucius Malfoy capturing the board narrative. Dumbledore managing his own testimony. The 3 board members Marchbanks doesn't have yet voting against the petition. He looked at the fire. "But worry, the kind that spreads and takes over, that's not useful. You can only do what you can do." "You sound like you've been saying that for years," Hermione said. "I have," Harry said. "The fire burned." "Harry," Hermione said carefully, after a while. "The thing Snape said? About the permanent alteration. The psychological dependency." She was choosing her words. "If it had worked. If you'd taken the food. Would you have known?" Harry thought about it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think, possibly not. That's the design of it, isn't it? You don't feel the thing working. You just feel the feeling it produces, and the feeling seems real because it is real, chemically, in the moment." He paused. "The reason I noticed was that I was already watching for it. If I hadn't been watching..." He stopped. "Then it would have worked," Hermione said. "Yes," Harry said. "And I would have gone to Dumbledore's office Tuesday morning and said, 'Sir, I'm very sorry about the fuss I made. I think I was tired from the journey, and I would have thought I meant it.'" He looked at the fire. "And I would have spent the next 7 years being the boy he needed me to be." The room was quiet. "I'm glad you read the Potions Index," Neville said finally. "I'm glad I had the train journey," Harry said. And somewhere in the castle, in a circular office lined with silver instruments, a man with half-moon glasses and a long silver beard sat and read and wrote and thought, and the instruments spun their various readings, and the one calibrated to Harry's magical signature spun faster than it ever had, which was a thing Dumbledore had always expected to find satisfying, being evidence of what he'd always known about the boy. But which he was finding tonight, for the first time, entirely and completely alarming. Chapter 5. Fire season Saturday arrived the way important days always do, with completely ordinary weather. Gray sky, light rain, the smell of wet stone coming through the dormitory window when Harry opened it at 5:30 to let Hedwig in from wherever she'd been. She landed on his arm and looked at him with her amber eyes, and he stroked her head once, carefully, and she made a sound that was more opinion than greeting, which he'd come to understand was her specific form of affection. "I know," he said. She ruffled her feathers and went to her perch. Harry dressed, checked the document file one final time, not because he thought anything had changed, but because the act of checking was itself steadying, a physical confirmation that the work was real, and went downstairs. The common room was empty except for Fred and George, who were already awake and sitting across from each other at the central table with the alert, contained energy of people who have been awake for some time and have been doing something quiet with it. When Harry came down, they looked up simultaneously with the identical expression that meant they'd been expecting him. "We wrote to Dad," Fred said. "He wrote back," George said. Fred slid a letter across the table. Harry picked it up. Arthur Weasley's handwriting was round and enthusiastic and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who writes quickly because they have a lot to say. The letter was 3 pages and it began, characteristically, not with pleasantries but with the thing he most wanted to convey. "Fred, George, what you've described is both deeply troubling and not, I will be honest with you, entirely surprising to those of us who have spent time watching how decisions get made at the ministry level. The headmaster's influence over institutional process has been a subject of quiet concern in several departments for years. The difficulty has always been documentation. The boy has documentation. I have spoken, carefully and in general terms, with a colleague in magical law who has confirmed that the 1842 provisions are exactly as Mr. Potter described, and that an invocation by a student in good standing is not something the board can dismiss on procedural grounds without violating the charter quite seriously. Marchbanks will know this. She's been waiting for precisely this kind of clean invocation. Tell Mr. Potter 2 things from me. First, Lucius Malfoy will arrive with his own motion and his own documentation. He has been building this case for a different reason, and his preferred outcome is a board with more Malfoy-friendly oversight, not less oversight in general. The distinction matters enormously. Second, there are people at the ministry who would like to be on the right side of this but who need to see which way Saturday goes before they'll commit. Win clearly and cleanly and they'll follow. Give anyone ammunition to call it a political operation and they won't. I'm proud of Fred and George for doing the right thing here. Tell Mr. Potter I hope he's eating properly." Arthur Weasley. Harry read it twice, smiled briefly at the last line, and handed it back. "Your father is a good man," Harry said. "He really is," George said, with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who has always known this and never had reason to qualify it. "He's also right about Malfoy." "I know," Harry said. "I've been thinking about how to handle it." He sat down. The fire was burning at its early morning low, throwing orange light across the old carpet. "The board session has 2 separate processes happening. My petition under the safeguarding provisions, which is specific and documented. And whatever Lucius Malfoy files, which is political and general." He looked at the fire. "Marchbanks controls the order of proceedings. She'll have seen this kind of procedural conflict before. Can you trust her to manage it?" Fred asked. "I trust her to manage it correctly according to her own judgment," Harry said. "Which means I need to understand her judgment well enough to know that it aligns." He pulled out Marchbanks's letters, which he had read enough times to have them essentially memorized. "She's been trying to call this session for 2 years. She's been blocked on procedural grounds. She's not going to let Malfoy capture her session." He paused. "But I can't assume. I need to talk to her before the session starts." She said not to be late. Hermione said from the staircase, appearing in the dormitory doorway fully dressed and carrying the document file he'd given her to hold. "I know," Harry said. "I intend to be extremely early." They left the castle at 6:45. McGonagall had arranged the Flu connection, a formal school-sanctioned educational visit to the ministry, filed with the administrative office the previous afternoon, which was one of the last moves Harry had asked her to make. The paperwork was clean and unremarkable. 6 students attending an educational session at the Ministry building. Which was true, technically, in the way that a great many true things are also technically something else. The group was Harry, Hermione, Neville, Susan Bones, Terry Boot, and Draco Malfoy, who appeared in the entrance hall at 6:30 with a small bag and the expression of someone who had thought carefully about every implication of being here and had come anyway. He and Harry didn't speak about it. They didn't need to. Harry nodded, Draco nodded, and they joined the group. McGonagall saw them off from the fireplace in her office. She was dressed for formal proceedings, robes Harry hadn't seen before, deep green, with the kind of precise bearing that came from having spent 37 years deciding that how you held yourself was a statement. She looked at each of them in turn, and when she got to Harry, she did the complicated expression one final time. "The session begins at 10, she said. "I will be in the gallery by 9:45. The statement is with Marchbanks." She paused. "Harry. Professor. Your mother would not have been afraid," she said, and turned back to her desk before he could respond, because McGonagall was the kind of person who delivered the important things and then immediately gave you room to carry them yourself. Harry stepped into the fleur. The Ministry of Magic at 7 in the morning was a different creature to the Ministry at business hours. The atrium was vast and cool and only sparsely populated, a few overnight workers finishing shifts, a maintenance witch buffing the golden floor with a charm that made small circular reflections on the ceiling, a security guard at the visitor entrance reading yesterday's prophet with the focused attention of someone who has been at the same desk for 6 hours. The board chambers were on level 4, past the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, in a section of the building that had the specific aesthetic of institutional seriousness, darker stone, higher ceilings, the portraits here formal and watchful rather than the chatty network in the castle. Harry found the chambers easily, moved through 3 corridors with the practiced orientation of someone who had studied the ministry floor plan in the records room Wednesday afternoon, and found Griselda Marchbanks standing outside the chamber doors at 7:15 with a cup of tea and the expression of someone who has been awake since 5 and considers this normal. She was smaller than Harry had imagined from her letters. 89 years old and made entirely of sharp angles, sharp eyes, sharp jawline, sharp precise quality to how she moved and held herself. She was wearing robes that were clearly old and clearly expensive and clearly not something she'd spent any time thinking about this morning, because Griselda Marchbanks was not a woman who thought about robes when there was work to do. She looked at Harry and said, without preamble, "You're early." "You said not to be late," Harry said. "I interpreted that as a general instruction to be early." "I like you already," she said, which was her version of a greeting. "Come inside. I want to go through the order of proceedings before anyone else arrives." The board chamber was oval, paneled in dark wood, with a long horseshoe table at the center, and a raised gallery along one wall where observers could sit. At the head of the horseshoe table was a single chair that was slightly elevated, slightly more formal, with Marchbanks's name on a placard in front of it, which meant she was chairing today, which meant the session structure was hers to define. Harry sat across from her at the near end of the table and the others distributed themselves in the gallery, except for Susan Bones, who went immediately to find her aunt's office, and Draco, who sat at the gallery's far end, slightly separate, in the position of someone who was present but not affiliated. "The petition," Marchbanks said. She had a copy open in front of her. "I've read it 4 times. The documentation is thorough. More thorough than I expected from a first-year student. It was a group effort," Harry said. "The kitchen instruction sheet," she said, tapping it. "Dumbledore's handwriting. Have you verified that against a confirmed handwriting sample?" "McGonagall's statement includes a verification," Harry said. "She's seen his handwriting for 37 years. She states under formal witness that it's consistent." He paused. "I also cross-referenced it against the placement documents and the kitchen supply authorization." 3 separate documents, same hand, consistent letter form. Marchbanks looked at him. McGonagall is coming. Gallery 945. Snape? He said he'd be here. Harry said. I expect him to be punctual. The emergency authority provision, Marchbanks said, moving to the next document. I've had this reviewed by my legal counsel overnight. The 90-day expiry clause is precisely as your student has analyzed. She set the document down. This is the most significant finding in the file. If valid, it invalidates nearly every administrative action taken by Dumbledore under expanded authority since February 1982. That is an enormous amount of institutional decision-making. She met Harry's eyes. Do you understand the implications of what you've brought? I understand that the implications extend beyond what I'm specifically asking for, Harry said, and I want to be clear about what I'm asking for. I'm asking for accountability for specific documented actions against me. I'm not asking for general institutional collapse. Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment. You're 11 years old, she said, not as an observation but as a thing she was checking against what she was seeing. Yes, Harry said. Why aren't you frightened? I've been frightened my whole life, Harry said, simply and without drama. Of the Dursleys, of being wrong about something, of being without anything. This is frightening in a different way. It has consequences. But they're consequences that can be managed. He looked at her steadily. What frightens me is situations where the outcome is out of my hands. This one isn't. Marchbanks looked at him for another moment. Lucius Malfoy is filing a competing motion, she said. I know. He has his own documentation. Some of it corroborates yours. Some of it serves his own agenda. I know, Harry said. Can you separate the proceedings? Take my petition first, on its own specific documented merits, and treat Malfoy's motion as a separate matter for separate consideration? Procedurally, yes, Marchbanks said. If I rule that the two motions are distinct in scope and subject matter, which I believe they are. Your petition is specific, documented, and narrow. His motion is general, political, and broad. She picked up her quill. Malfoy will object. He'll object to the procedure, Harry said. Not to the specific documented findings. He can't object to the kitchen instruction sheet. He can't object to the handwriting verification, or the supply chain records, or the expired provision. If the proceeding is structured so that the documented evidence is addressed first, on its own terms, the findings stand independently of whatever political maneuvering happens afterward. Marchbanks set down her quill. She looked at him the way McGonagall had looked at him when he mentioned the 1842 bylaws. The look of someone encountering something that doesn't fit their expectation of what an 11-year-old is. You prepared for this by reading board procedural rules, she said. Tuesday afternoon, Harry said. In the secondary archive. There was a bound volume of board procedure from 1901 that nobody has read since 1901, Marchbanks said. She turned back to her documents. All right. I'll structure the proceedings as you've described. Your petition first, addressed on documented merits. Malfoy's motion tabled for separate consideration after. She made a note. I'll want you to present your petition yourself. Not through McGonagall, not through legal counsel. You. Yes, Harry said. Albus will be here, she said. The board rules require him to be notified, which means he was notified last night. He will be seated at the opposite head of the table. He will be present for your presentation. She paused. He is excellent at appearing reasonable while saying things that undermine the basis of an accusation. I know, Harry said. You'll need to not let him, she said. I know, Harry said again. Marchbanks looked at him one more time, and something in her expression shifted into something that was, for a woman of 89 with 40-odd years of board membership, remarkably close to hope. Right then, she said. Tell me the order you plan to present the documents. They went through it twice. Harry walked Marchbanks through the document sequence, the logic of the presentation, the specific evidentiary connections he intended to draw. She asked sharp questions and he answered them directly, and twice she suggested a different ordering of material that was better than what he had, which he accepted without argument because it was better, and she looked slightly surprised the first time he did this, which he noted. By 9 o'clock the chamber had begun to fill. The Board of Governors was 12 people. Harry had done his research. He knew their names and their general political affiliations and their terms of service, and he had a rough sense of how they would break. 3 broadly sympathetic to the petition based on their documented positions on student rights, 4 with known Malfoy family connections who would follow Lucius's lead, 2 who were independent and genuinely unpredictable, and 3 more who were technically independent but had a long professional relationship with Dumbledore that would influence their reading. He watched them come in and matched names to faces, confirming and revising as he went. The 4 Malfoy-adjacent governors arrived together, which was a signal in itself. One of them, a thin man named Montague with a very precisely trimmed beard, stopped when he saw Harry sitting at the table rather than in the gallery, looked at Marchbanks, and raised an eyebrow. Marchbanks didn't acknowledge him. Susan Bones came back with Amelia Bones at 9:15. Amelia Bones was a square, solid woman with a monocle and the kind of presence that came from spending 2 decades running a department in a building full of people who needed managing. She looked at Harry with the monocle and said, "Potter, good work on the invocation. The provision citation is clean." "Thank you," Harry said. "Your guidance on the correspondence helped." "We can discuss that after," she said, which was the brisk acknowledgement of someone who had a lot to do. She sat in the gallery, directly behind Harry's position at the table, which was an alignment that would be visible to everyone in the room and was therefore a deliberate statement. Snape arrived at 9:20. He came through the chamber door in black robes with the particular quality of motion that was always Snape, contained and purposeful and taking up exactly as much space as he intended to take and not an inch more. He looked at Harry, looked at the gallery, looked at the head of the table where Marchbanks was arranging documents, and sat 3 seats from Amelia Bones in the gallery without speaking to anyone. McGonagall came in at 9:40 precisely, as promised, in her green robes. She went to the gallery, and sat beside Amelia Bones with the bearing of a woman who has made a decision she intends to maintain. At 9:52, Lucius Malfoy arrived. He came in with 2 other people Harry didn't recognize, not board members, not ministry officials, but clearly there in a support capacity, and he moved through the chamber with the ease of a man who has spent a great deal of time in rooms like this, and has always been on the right side of the table. He was tall, blond in the specific way that suggested the blondness was something the Malfoy family had arranged generations ago and maintained as policy, with a silver-tipped cane that was more accessory than necessity and robes that probably cost more than the Dursleys' car. He looked at the document file in front of Harry's seat. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, the rapid reassessment of a man who is good at this and has noted the quality of preparation. Then he looked at Draco in the gallery, and Draco looked back, and something happened between them in the 3 seconds before Lucius looked away that Harry couldn't fully read but that contained, on Draco's side, the specific stillness of someone who has committed to something and is holding it. Lucius Malfoy sat at the table. He put a document case on the table with deliberate care. He did not look at Harry again immediately, which was a choice. At 9:58, Dumbledore arrived. He came in alone, which Harry had expected. He was wearing robes of deep purple that were formal without being ceremonial, and the silver beard and half-moon glasses, and he moved into the room with the long-practiced presence of Albus Dumbledore in an institutional setting, which was to say, he entered and the room reorganized itself slightly around him, in the way that rooms do around people who have stood at the center of things for a very long time. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back. Dumbledore's expression was warm. It was always warm. But Harry was looking at the thing underneath the warmth, the quality he'd first noticed in the Great Hall when the smile changed, and what he saw was a man who had spent 48 hours revising, and who had arrived this morning with a position, and who was prepared. Good. Harry was also prepared. "Good morning, Albus," Marchbanks said from the head of the table. Her voice was perfectly level. Griselda, Dumbledore said, with the warmth that was always personal with her, specifically, the warmth of long institutional partnership. I see we have a full chamber. We have a valid petition, Marchbanks said, which requires a full chamber. She looked at her watch. We'll begin at 10. Dumbledore sat. He looked across the table at Harry one more time, and this time the look had something different in it, not the warm curiosity of the feast, not the compressed expression of a man running out of moves, but something Harry read as genuine. Not warmth. Something more complicated and more real. Almost, he thought, something like recognition. Then Marchbanks called the session to order, and it began. The formalities took 6 minutes. Roll call, quorum confirmation, session type, emergency, invoked under 1842 student safeguarding provisions by Mr. Harry James Potter, first-year student, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Marchbanks read the invocation and cited the provision and established the scope of the session, and when Montague attempted to raise a procedural objection about the competing motion, she cut him off with the precision of a woman who has been on this board for 40 years and has heard every procedural objection available, and has opinions about them all. The competing motion has been tabled for separate consideration, she said. Separate in scope, separate in subject matter, separate in proceedings. This session addresses the petition first on its own documented merits. Mr. Malfoy will have the floor for his motion after. Anyone who objects to this order can file a formal procedural challenge through the standard process, which takes 14 days. She looked at Montague. Do you wish to file a formal procedural challenge? Montague did not. Good, Marchbanks said. Mr. Potter. You have the floor. Harry stood up. He looked around the table. 12 board members, Dumbledore at the far end, Marchbanks at the near end, the gallery full of witnesses. He had never spoken in a room like this before. He had spoken in the great hall in front of 300 students and the entire faculty, but this room was different, smaller, more powerful, more specifically consequential. He wasn't afraid. He was precise. I am Harry Potter, he said, and his voice carried cleanly in the oval room. I am 11 years old. I have been a student at Hogwarts for 5 days. On the first of those days, the evening of September 1st, I identified a compound loyalty potion in my food at the welcoming feast. I have spent the subsequent 4 days assembling documentation. I am here to present those findings and ask this board to make a determination about the actions of Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. He paused. I am not here, he said, to destroy Hogwarts or remove every structure that exists. I am not here because I'm angry, or because I was put up to this by anyone, or because I don't understand the complexity of the situation. I am here because specific documented actions were taken against me without my knowledge or consent, and I believe this board has the authority and the responsibility to determine whether those actions were appropriate. He paused. I believe they were not. The documentation will show why. He opened the file and began. He started with the kitchen instruction sheet, because it was the most concrete, the most undeniable, the piece that required the fewest assumptions. He set it on the table in front of Marchbanks, who passed it to the board member on her right, who passed it along the horseshoe. While it traveled, Harry described it, the handwriting verification, the supply chain context, the specific instruction to exclude it from standard kitchen records. That document, he said, describes Dumbledore directing the preparation of food for a specific seat, my seat, in a manner explicitly excluded from official record. The instruction was given to Dobby, a house elf employed by Hogwarts, whose account is documented and whose testimony is covered under the institutional staff provisions of the 1842 bylaws. He set a copy of Dobby's account alongside it. The request to exclude this from standard records is itself significant. It is the act of someone who knew the action would not survive official scrutiny. Montague said. House elf testimony is covered under Section 31 of the 1842 bylaws, Harry said without looking at him. As I just stated. He moved to the supply chain documents. These are herbology cultivation records maintained independently by Professor Pomona Sprout. They show unusual bitterroot requisitions in August of this year, and in 1989 and 1990, all authorized under Dumbledore's personal signature, all routed to the school kitchen supply. Professor Sprout's independent note on these requisitions is attached. He paused. The 1989 and 1990 quantities are consistent with preparation testing. The 1991 quantity is consistent with final compound preparation. This is not an accident or an isolated event. It is a 3-year preparation. He watched the board as the documents made their way around the table. The 3 sympathetic members were reading carefully, leaning forward. The 4 malfadjacent were reading with controlled expressions, calculating. The 2 independents were looking between the documents and Dumbledore with the specific back and forth of people forming their own opinion. Dumbledore was sitting very still. He had not spoken. He had not reached for any of the documents as they passed him, had not questioned any of Harry's statements, had not deployed the warmth. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table in front of him and looking at Harry, and the look was not the performance from Tuesday, not the calculation from Wednesday. It was something Harry had not seen from him before, and it took Harry a moment to classify it. It was close to grief. Not guilt. Grief. The specific expression of someone who sees a future they wanted closing. Harry kept going. He walked through the monitoring charm documentation, the portrait committee records, the specific students monitored, the reporting instructions that had been logged over committee objection. He walked through the placement decision and the documented intent, the psychological profiling, the compliance markers, the explicit design of his childhood environment. He quoted directly the relevant lines from the monitoring records. He heard a sound from the gallery at pre-existing framework of low self-worth and didn't look up. When he got to the emergency authority provision, he laid Terry's legal analysis alongside the original legislation. The provision invoked in November 1981, he said, expired by its own terms 90 days later, on the 2nd of February, 1982. This expiry was not processed, because the archivist responsible for flagging it was removed from his position 3 weeks after filing a formal objection to the invocation. He set Cornelius Fawn's archived document on the table. The archivist's objection is documented under the historical record integrity provisions of 1612, which makes it irremovable and permanently on record. He paused. The headmaster has been operating under an authority measure that expired 44 years ago. Every action taken under that authority, every administrative decision, every expansion of his discretionary power reference to that provision as precedent, requires review. The board had gone very quiet. I am not asking for that review today, Harry said. I am noting it as context and asking that it be formally initiated by this board as a separate process. He paused. What I am asking for today is a formal determination on 3 specific questions. He looked at Marchbanks. First, whether the administration of loyalty potions to a minor student without consent or knowledge constitutes a violation of the student's rights under the Hogwarts Charter and applicable magical law. He set McGonagall's statement on the table. Professor McGonagall's signed statement provides staff-level institutional confirmation of this account and its context. Second, whether the monitoring charm network and its specific application to my placement and childhood environment constitutes an unauthorized extension of the headmaster's authority over a minor outside the school's jurisdiction. Third, whether the actions described constitute a pattern of behavior requiring formal administrative sanction. He sat down. The room was quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then Dumbledore said, "May I speak?" Marchbanks looked at him. "You may." Dumbledore rose. He stood at his end of the table with the full weight of who he was, and Harry watched him carefully, because this was the moment McGonagall had warned him about. When he spoke, his voice had no performance in it, no warmth, no careful calibration. What he spoke with was something more fundamental, the voice of a man who believed what he was saying. "Everything Mr. Potter has presented is factually accurate," Dumbledore said. The room shifted. The food was prepared as described. Dumbledore continued. The monitoring charms were installed as described. The placement was arranged as described. The psychological framework was considered as described. He paused. I will not stand here and tell this board that any of it was falsified or that Mr. Potter has misrepresented the situation. He has not. He looked down the table at Harry. He has been precise and thorough and correct in every detail. He paused again. What I would ask this board to consider, he said, is context. Not as an excuse. As an explanation. He looked around the table, and the gravity of 40 years of earned authority was in every line of his face. Voldemort is not defeated. He is diminished. He is weakened. But the magical forensic evidence gathered in the aftermath of November 1981 was clear on one point. The entity that called himself Lord Voldemort was not destroyed, and given the nature of the magic he practiced, there is a strong probability that he will return. He paused. When he does, the wizarding world will need someone capable of facing him. The specific magical signature and the specific prophetic record, which this board is familiar with, point to Mr. Potter as that person. A prophecy, Marchbanks said. A prophecy, Dumbledore confirmed. Made before Mr. Potter's birth. I will provide a full copy to this board if requested. The substance is that a child with specific attributes, born as the 7th month died, to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times, would have the power to defeat him. He looked at Harry. Mr. Potter fits that description precisely. The room was very still. Harry had known about the prophecy since Wednesday. He'd found a reference in the secondary archive, partial and indirect, enough to understand the shape of it. He'd thought about it for 2 days and decided that the existence of a prophecy didn't change what was on the table this morning. It was context. It was not an answer. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. I don't dispute the prophecy, Harry said. I don't dispute that Voldemort may return, or that it might involve me. He paused. I dispute the method. He looked at the board. A general who needs his soldiers to be brave does not give them potions to manufacture courage. He earns their trust. He explains the stakes. He gives them the information they need to make a real choice. He looked back at Dumbledore. You didn't give me a choice. You gave me a childhood designed to make me need you, and food designed to make me love you, and a plan built on the assumption that if I knew the truth I'd make the wrong decision. You were a child, Dumbledore said, and for the first time his voice had an edge in it. You were an infant, I am a child now, Harry said, and I have done more with accurate information in 4 days than your plan accomplished in 10 years. He held Dumbledore's gaze. The information does not make me weaker. It makes me more capable. What you were protecting, the plan, required me to be less capable than I actually am. The silence was of a specific quality. The quality of 12 people realizing something simultaneously. Furthermore, Harry said, because he had one more thing and it was the one he'd been building toward. The plan required me to trust you absolutely. You needed my trust to be structural rather than earned, because you knew, you had to know, that if I trusted you based on what you'd actually done, I would not trust you. He paused. And you were right. I don't. He looked at Dumbledore. Not because the potions made me distrust you. Because the potions are the reason not to. Dumbledore sat down. He did it the same way he had at the feast, the slow, deliberate lowering of a man choosing the ground carefully. But this time the silence that followed was different. At the feast the silence had been shock. Here it was something more like reckoning, the quality of a room full of adults sitting with the fact that an 11-year-old had just said something that was entirely, incontrovertibly true and that several of them had been thinking for years and had not said. Montague cleared his throat. Regardless of the Mr. Montague, Marchbanks said, with the flat precision of someone who has a job to do and intends to do it. You'll have opportunity to speak during Malfoy's motion. Right now, I have 3 questions to put to the board. She looked around the table. All those in favor of finding that the administration of loyalty potions to a minor student without consent constitutes a violation of the student's rights under the Hogwarts Charter? 7 hands. 2 independents, 3 sympathetic members, and Harry noted this with specific attention, 2 of the 4 Malfoy-adjacent members, who had apparently decided, in the course of the last 40 minutes, that their own interests were better served by being on the documented side of this particular determination. Motion passes, Marchbanks said, making a note. All those in favor of finding that the monitoring charm network constitutes an unauthorized extension of Headmaster authority over a minor outside school jurisdiction? 8 hands. Motion passes. All those in favor of finding that the described actions constitute a pattern of behavior requiring formal administrative sanction? A pause. 10 hands. Not Lucius Malfoy, who had his own motion to think about. Not Montague. Everyone else. Motion passes, Marchbanks said, and her voice was absolutely level, but Harry, who was watching her, caught something in her eyes that was the specific satisfaction of a person who has been waiting for a door to open for 2 years and has just watched it come off its hinges. The board will take a 15-minute recess before addressing Mr. Malfoy's motion. The gallery cleared during the recess into the outer hall, where a high, vaulted ceiling echoed the murmur of a dozen separate conversations. Amelia Bones found Harry first. She stood in front of him with her monocle and her square face and said, "You did that well." "The board helped," Harry said. "The board responded to good work," she said. "That's different from helping." She paused. "The unauthorized monitoring of a minor outside school jurisdiction, that creates grounds for a formal criminal inquiry. Distinct from the board's administrative sanction. Do you understand what that means?" "It means Dumbledore may be looking at more than removal from his administrative position," Harry said. "It means a full investigation," Bones said. "My department. I've already started the process." She said this without any particular drama, the flat statement of someone who began processes when they were needed. "The inquiry will take time. Months. It will be thorough." She paused. "He won't be arrested this morning. He's Dumbledore. But the file will be open and it will be accurate, and when it concludes it will conclude based on the evidence. That's all I'm asking for," Harry said. Bones looked at him. "Your mother worked for the ministry for 2 years before she died," she said. Unspeakable division. Briefly. She was. She paused. "She was very good." Harry filed that away. Another piece of a person he was slowly assembling from other people's memories. "Thank you," he said. McGonagall was in the outer hall, standing with the particular stillness of someone who is processing several things simultaneously. When Harry came over, she looked at him with the complicated expression, which was by now so familiar that he could read its components: grief, pride, something that was and wasn't regret, something that was and wasn't relief. "The 10 hands," she said. "Did you expect that many?" "I hoped for 8, Harry said honestly. 10 was better than I planned for." "The 2 Malfoy-adjacent members," she said. "That was self-interest," Harry said. "They read the documentation and decided that a finding against Dumbledore was a cleaner position than being recorded as having voted against documented evidence. Lucius Malfoy can't protect them from documented evidence." He paused. "Though he'll try. His motion," McGonagall said, "will produce its own outcomes," Harry said. "I'm not controlling it. I told Marchbanks what I could and she'll manage the session." He looked at her. "You were there when Dumbledore said the prophecy was real." "Yes." "Did you know about it?" McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "I knew a prophecy existed," she said. "I did not know its content until this morning." She paused. "Albus told me there were compelling reasons for your preparation." "He did not tell me." She stopped. "I did not ask clearly enough what those reasons were." "You believed he wouldn't do something that needed explaining," Harry said. "Yes," she said quietly. "I believe that." Harry looked out through the tall windows at the morning London sky, grey and permanent and large. He's not wrong about Voldemort, Harry said. No, McGonagall said. He's probably not. He's wrong about everything else, Harry said. But the threat is real. I accept that. He paused. The difference is that I can face a real threat without being engineered to do it. I would rather face it as myself. He looked at her. That's what he couldn't trust. That I might be enough, without the engineering. McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. The extraordinary thing, she said, is that you are more than enough. She straightened. The session is about to resume. Snape was near the door when Harry turned back toward the chamber. He was standing apart from everyone, as he stood in most situations, with his arms folded and his expression flat. He met Harry's eyes briefly, and Harry nodded, and Snape nodded back, one single movement. That was all. It was enough. Lucius Malfoy's motion was a different kind of session. Where Harry had been precise and documentary, Malfoy was theatrical and broad, the kind of presentation that was built for a different audience, the general Wisengamot, perhaps, or the newspapers, rather than 12 board members with a full evidentiary record already in front of them. He produced testimony from 3 former students, all of it legitimate and corroborating and useful, and he presented the Wisengamot sentencing records, and he called for a full no-confidence motion and immediate removal. Marchbanks managed it correctly, as Harry had expected she would. She accepted the relevant documentary evidence. She referred the Azkaban sentencing material to Amelia Bones's department for independent review, which Bones confirmed on the record she was already initiating. She declined the no-confidence motion on the grounds that the board's administrative sanction process had already been activated under Harry's petition, and running a concurrent no-confidence motion would create procedural conflict. Malfoy objected. Marchbanks ruled the objection out of order. Malfoy objected to the ruling. Marchbanks looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been on this board since before Lucius Malfoy was born and said, with absolute calm, "You have 7 days to file a written appeal. Is there anything else?" There was not anything else. The formal administrative sanction against Dumbledore was issued at 12:45, a suspension of Headmaster authority pending the investigation by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, effective immediately, with a deputy headmaster arrangement to be put in place at Hogwarts within 24 hours. Dumbledore sat through the reading of the sanction without speaking. He was looking at Harry, and Harry was looking back, and the grief that Harry had identified in his expression had not moved. When Marchbanks closed the session, Dumbledore rose and came slowly around the table. Harry stayed in his seat. Dumbledore stopped in front of him and looked down, and Harry looked up, and for a moment the board chamber was quiet around them in the specific way of a space that has been holding its breath. "I underestimated you," Dumbledore said. "Not warm. Not careful." "True. I know," Harry said. "I want you to understand," Dumbledore said, "that everything I did was done because I believed, I genuinely believe, that you are the only person who can end this. Voldemort. For good. For everyone." He paused. "I did not want you to face that unprepared." "I know," Harry said again. "And you still, yes," Harry said. "Because being prepared to face something and being engineered to face it are not the same thing. One of those produces someone capable. The other produces someone controlled." He met Dumbledore's eyes steadily. "You needed me controlled. I needed to be capable. We didn't want the same thing." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "What will you do?" Dumbledore said. "When Voldemort returns? Without the framework I built? I'll figure it out," Harry said. "With people I actually trust. Based on information that's actually true." He paused. "You'd be surprised what's possible when you work with the truth." Dumbledore was quiet. "Harry," he said, and the name came out without the management, and without the warmth, and without any of the construction, just the name, raw. "I am sorry. I don't expect that means anything to you. I want to say it nonetheless." Harry looked at him. He thought about what sorry meant, and what it cost, and whether it was enough, and decided those were questions for a later time and a different setting, when the work wasn't still in the middle of happening. "I heard you," he said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't dismissal. It was what it was, an acknowledgement that the words existed, that the man who said them was real, and that what happened next was a different question from what had happened before. Dumbledore nodded. He turned and walked out of the board chamber with the same deliberate movement he always had, through the door, and into the corridor beyond, and his footsteps faded. Marchbanks, who had been making notes at the head of the table, looked up at Harry. "That," she said, "was one of the more interesting board sessions I've chaired." "Thank you for running it fairly," Harry said. "Fairness is the job," she said, with the slight asperity of someone who considers this obvious. "Go eat something. You're 11. You've been doing this since 7 in the morning." She paused. "Good work, Potter." He gathered his documents. In the gallery, his group was reassembling from the recess, Hermione with her notes, Neville with his notebook, Terry with his legal parchment, Susan, and Draco. Draco was standing at the gallery railing, looking at the space Dumbledore had just vacated, with an expression Harry hadn't seen on him before. Not the complicated one, not the constructed one. Something simpler and more genuine. "Your father's motion didn't pass," Harry said. "I know," Draco said. "He's not going to be happy." "I know." A pause. "He'll be angry with Marchbanks. And with Bones. And with—" He stopped. "With you?" Harry asked. Draco was quiet. "He doesn't know I was here," Draco said. "He may not find out." He paused. "And if he does—" He stopped again, and the expression shifted into something Harry recognized. The expression of someone standing at a decision that costs something real. "If he does," Harry said, "you did the right thing and you know you did. That's something nobody can take back from you." Draco looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine." "I don't know if it'll be fine," Harry said. "I know you made a real choice." "That's different from fine." He looked at the empty board table. "Most people don't." They stood there for a moment, two boys in a ministry chamber, standing at the edge of something that had just changed. Then Hermione said from the doorway, "Harry, you really do need to eat something." And the moment broke open into the ordinary, and Harry picked up his bag, and they went. They came back to Hogwarts in the early afternoon. The castle had the specific weekend quiet that Harry hadn't fully experienced yet, the quality of a large stone building with most of its inhabitants not in class, the noise distributed differently, more organic, less organized. The grounds were visible through the entrance hall windows, wet and green under the gray sky, and a couple of older students were walking near the lake with the aimlessness of a free afternoon. The great hall was empty except for the house elves clearing the lunch things, and Dobby looked up when Harry came in, and the look that passed between them was brief and sufficient. "It went well," Harry said. Dobby's ears went straight. Harry ate the delayed lunch that the house elves produced with cheerful urgency, sitting at the Gryffindor table with the small group spread out around him, nobody talking much. The work had a specific after-quality to it, the particular quiet that follows sustained effort, not emptiness but a kind of cleared space. Neville was eating with the good appetite of someone who has done a real thing. Hermione was reading, because Hermione needed reading the way other people needed sleep. Fred and George had appeared from somewhere and were sitting at the far end of the table in uncharacteristic silence, eating with the air of people who are thinking something important that they're not ready to say yet. "The castle will need a new headmaster," Terry said at some point. "Deputy headmaster temporarily," Harry said. "Which is McGonagall by default." "She'll be good at it," Neville said. "She's been good at everything," Hermione said, "while someone else got the title for it." She said it without particular bitterness, just as a fact she'd identified. "The third-floor corridor," Harry said, because it had been in the back of his mind since Wednesday, and it hadn't left. "Whatever's up there doesn't go away because Dumbledore's authority is suspended. Whatever he was protecting, or whatever he was luring." He stopped. "Reorganized. Quirrell knows what's there." I need to think about that more. Today? Neville asked. Not today, Harry said. Today we've done enough. He looked out at the gray sky through the tall windows. Today we just finished the day. What does that look like for you? Hermione asked. Harry thought about it. I want to go to the library, he said. But not for this. Just reading. Hermione looked at him. Something that isn't evidence. Something that's just interesting, he said. I haven't done that in a week. She smiled. It was the genuine one, not the controlled precise smile, but the one that was slightly lopsided and reached her eyes and belonged to a 12-year-old girl who loved books for what they were and not for what they could be used for. The library has a section on magical creature history, she said. Third shelf from the left back wall. It's not on the curriculum. Let's start there, Harry said. They went. The castle held them in its stone and candlelight quiet, and the portraits watched them pass with their painted eyes, and somewhere in the secondary archive Cornelius Fawn's objections sat in its file with 44 years of patient irremovability, and somewhere in the ministry a file had been opened that bore a name that had not been properly investigated in a decade. And in the gallery of a board chamber a handwritten letter from a Hogwarts student sat with its documents, and its evidence, and its 11-year-old precision, already entered into the permanent official record where nothing that met the historical record integrity provisions could ever be removed. The door to the library swung open, and the smell of books, old paper and binding glue and that particular dry warmth of a room that was reddened constantly, came out into the corridor, and Harry stepped inside. He found the section Hermione had described. Pulled a book at random. Opened it to the middle. It was about Kelpies, as it turned out. Their transformation habits and their specific relationship to Scottish freshwater and the way they'd been documented by the early settlers of the Highlands, who had thought they were something else entirely and had written about them with the specific mix of terror and wonder that people bring to things they don't have a category for yet. Harry sat down with his back against the shelf and read it from the beginning, and didn't think about board sessions or documentation or Voldemort or prophecies or the third-floor corridor or Quirrell's turban. He just read. The afternoon light moved across the library floor, slow and gray and entirely ordinary, and Harry Potter sat in it and was, for a little while, just a boy in a library who was reading something he didn't need for anything. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough.